Chapter 951, Outrider. Nightmare landed on the surface of the highway less than 100 meters away from the rushing swarm and galloped forward without ever slowing down. The wind howled in Sunny's ears as the dark stallion's adamantine hooves rang sonorously on the cold concrete. A vicious grin somehow found its way to Sunny's face. I must have lost my mind. Diving headlong into a tide of hundreds of nightmare creatures was no cause for a smile, but for some reason, he felt exhilarated. Perhaps it was the sinister whispers of the cursed jade sword that were subtly influencing him. Perhaps Nightmare was simply not the only one who longed to go on a murderous rampage. Ever since LO-49, nothing had gone right for Sunny. The bitter pressure of it all fueled him with frustration and the anger wished for a way out. Now, he was going to unleash it on these damned abominations. Die. Driven into a mad frenzy by the call of the dying wish, the first of the nightmare creatures leaped into the air, its fangs glinting in the moonlight. Sunny leaned forward to cut it apart, but before he could, Nightmare's jaw snapped and tore the beast's throat open. With a violent twist of his neck, the black stallion sent the convulsing body flying into the mass of abominations. In the next moment, they plunged into the swarm. The sin of Solace sang, slicing creature after creature apart. Wrapped in shadows, Sunny fought with stunning speed and precision, obliterating any abominations that tried to get close. It was as though he was surrounded by a whirlwind of rending jade. The flesh of nightmare creatures parted before the white blade of the beautiful Jian like water. Nightmare was no less deadly. The dark steed galloped forward, slaughtering creatures with his fangs, his horns, and his hooves. Some were torn apart. Some were thrown to the ground and trampled to death. Some were simply tossed aside like broken dolls by a shattering crash with the destrier's wide chest. He rushed through the mass of abominations like a dark omen of dread, leaving a bloody trail in his wake. To Sunny, it seemed as though Nightmare was especially lethal today. Perhaps it had to do with the black steed's long slumber, or maybe it was just a powerful combination of enchantments, attributes, and abilities that made the spacious coastal highway a perfect battlefield for his shadow. Nightmare's speed, strength, and resilience were enhanced when surrounded by darkness and shadows, and the polar night provided plenty of both. The tenebrous stallions might also grew the more he was feared, and currently, both his own mantle of fear ability and the omen of dread, enchantment of the sin of solace, were poisoning the rabid minds of hundreds of nightmare creatures with insidious terror. Maybe most importantly, the nightmare ability made the black steed more powerful the more nightmares he had subjugated, and by now there were hundreds of conquered dreams serving as his thralls. All of this meant that the large swarm of abominations blocking the convoy's path was in for a sea of suffering. However, that was not enough. Even while sundering one revolting body after another, Sunny saw that there were simply too many abominations ahead of them to slaughter them all. For now, Nightmare and he had been able to continue their bloody charge without slowing down. But as soon as enough abominations threw themselves into the carnage, that was bound to change. Once the rampaging stallion was stopped, the swarm could potentially overwhelm them by burying both under a mountain of bodies. Sunny and Nightmare could escape such a trap by turning into shadows, of course. But even if Sunny could eventually kill every single abomination, it would take too much time. Not only would more nightmare creatures inevitably join the mayhem, but the convoy was less than a dozen seconds from reaching the swarm. He had to remind himself that his goal was not to slaughter the hateful wretches that had dared to stand in his way. His goal was to clear a path for the column of battered human vehicles, whose passengers all depended on him to deliver them to safety. Curses. By now, most of the swarm must have been affected by the pull of the dying wish. All of them had nothing on their mind but one all-consuming desire to rip Sunny apart. Using that to his advantage, he commanded Nightmare to veer left, cutting through the tide of abominations and getting closer to the ocean. The black stallion pivoted and changed the direction of his murderous charge, but was soon met by an impenetrable wall of claws, fangs, suckers, and hideous appendages of all kinds. Even with Sunny dismantling one abomination after another with the sin of solace, the mass of them right ahead seemed too overwhelming to fight through it. Nightmare, however, seemed to think differently. Continuing forward at the same speed, he let out a contemptuous snort and then soared into a powerful jump. His hooves landed on the sea of abominations, crushing a few skulls, and then used the bloody pulp as support for a second leap. Before the nightmare creatures could react and tear at the stallion's belly, the two of them landed just outside the swarm, on the narrow stretch of empty land between the highway and the vast expanse of undulating black waves. Suppressing a shiver, Sunny sent Nightmare closer to the ocean, and then closer still, almost into the shallows, to the point where fountains of cold water started to fly from the courser's hooves with each stride. Just as expected, the swarm rushed to pursue the terrible steed and its slaughtering rider. The mass of abominations spilled from the highway both behind and in front of them, aiming to surround the enemy once more. Just as planned, with that many abominations leaving the road, the convoy received a chance to slip through. Luster sent the rhino crashing through the barrier separating the railroad from the thoroughfare, and continued forward along the slopes of the mountains, plowing through a few stragglers with its ram. The column of vehicles followed, with the irregulars clearing the path ahead as well as they could. Looking to his right, Sunny saw the massive silhouette of the APC speeding past his position, barely visible behind the sea of monsters. With a sigh, he ordered Nightmare to slow down so that the swarm would concentrate on them and give the convoy a chance to pull ahead. A few moments later, the tide of abominations descended upon them. Sunny and Nightmare fought like fiends, eviscerating dozens of creatures. The Shadow in a brutally gruesome way, his master with clean cuts of a pristine jade blade. Slowly, a pile of corpses started to grow around them, making it hard for new enemies to lunge at the dreadful pair. After this battle, Nightmare would have sown plenty of seeds of fear to harvest later. Of that, Sunny had no doubt. But even then, their luck was bound to run out. At some point, the mass of abominations pressing down on them had become too great to resist. The pile of corpses careened dangerously, threatening to entomb both Nightmare and Sunny, and new creatures were raining down on them like a flood. Behind them, the deep dark ocean murmured, cutting off the retreat. Just a moment before the tidal wave of nightmare creatures crashed on them, both the horse and the rider disappeared, turning into elusive shadows. As they glided past the frenzied sea of abomination, embraced by darkness, a choir of maddened howls tore the night apart. Chapter 952, Hidden Giant. On a dark, desolate highway, a black steed and its bleak rider emerged from the shadows. Adamantine hooves rang on concrete as they flew forward through the falling snow, soon catching up with a small column of battered vehicles. Overtaking one transport after another, Sunny briefly evaluated their condition. The convoy was roughly halfway to its destination, and none of the vehicles had failed yet. Each looked as if it had gone through a meat grinder, but whatever the technicians had done to the transports was still keeping them from breaking down on the road. Hopefully that would continue to be the case. His soldiers were doing a good job of warding off the nightmare creatures as well. Nothing had managed to attack the column in his absence. The refugees were all intact. Glancing at the military vehicles, Sunny sent a short communication to Gear. "How much ammo do you have left, Sergeant?" The response came in a crackle of interference. "Glad you back, Captain. Sufficient or too nearly spent." Sunny frowned. The worsening quality of the signal could mean only one thing. They seemed to be approaching a powerful gate. He concentrated for a moment to sense the call, and felt that it was gradually growing louder. God damn it. With a grimace, Sunny sent Nightmare forward and soon reached the head of the convoy, galloping alongside the rhino. He caught a glimpse of Luster, who was concentrating on driving the APC, and then looked into the darkness ahead. At the moment, there were not enough stragglers on the road to make him summon back Morgan's warbow. Abomination and Blackie were enough to deal with them. However, in the distance, still a few kilometers away, Sunny saw a hint of wrongness hidden in the darkness of the polar night. There was an ugly rift in the fabric of reality there, one that seemed small and inconsequential from distance, but had to be considerably wide and tall up close, blocking most of the highway. A nightmare gate. The question was, how long ago had it manifested? Depending on the answer, the abominations brought into the waking world by it could have long wandered away in search of prey, or were still lingering around. There is only one way to find out, I guess. Not in a hurry to get back to the roof of the rhino, Sonny remained in the saddle, wielding the sin of solace in one of his hands. He was tensely looking at the swiftly approaching gate, trying to notice the shapes of nightmare creatures that could have been hiding on the highway or the mountain slope nearby, even in the cold waters of the dark ocean. There were no enemies in the water, and no enemies on the road. However, the mountain slopes made him feel tense. For some reason, disturbed. Sonny studied the cliffs rising above the highway to understand what he had missed. Their shape was somewhat irregular, but he did not see any movement. That was until the slope itself moved, unfurling long limbs and turning away from the mountain to face the highway. Sonny uttered a stifled curse. At 10 meters tall, the creature was gargantuan. Its rough and uneven hide was almost of the same texture as the stone slope of the mountain, and its 8 segmented legs resembled wide pillars. It looked like a giant spider with an enormous, bulbous beehive attached to its carapace, and there were hundreds of small crimson eyes burning in the dark holes of that massive hump. Sonny's mouth turned dry. A tyrant. He did not know what rank the creature was, but it had to be a tyrant, one that carried an army of minions within its body, no less. The towering abomination was a dire threat itself, just from its sheer size alone, and there was no telling how strong and numerous the lesser monsters were. Worst of all, the convoy had no choice but to rush toward it. Overtaking the rhino, Sonny gritted his teeth. His mind was in disarray, and the damned whispers of the cursed sword were not making it any easier for him to think. How the hell do I deal with that thing? There was still almost a minute left before they would reach the gate and its guardian, so that was how long he had to come up with a solution. Sonny swiftly considered his best options. He could send Nightmare charging forward and attack the tyrant with his most powerful weapon, the Sin of Solace, to either cripple, kill, or lead the creature away from the road. Depending on the rank of the giant spider, that could either be a very good or an utterly terrible decision. Alternatively, he could summon his bow and finally use the wasteful, but devastating Death Dealer enchantment, potentially delivering a severe wound or outright killing the tyrant on the spot. The minions could be dealt with if he followed up with the Strike of Thunder, too. But if that did not work, he would be risking the entire convoy. Damnation. Sonny almost commanded Nightmare to rush toward the tyrant. But at that moment, something strange happened. The giant spider, who had been staring at the approaching human vehicles with malevolent intensity, suddenly froze for a moment and then took a step back. Then, the creature turned around and rushed toward the mountain, climbing the slope with its long, powerful legs. Just a few seconds later, it was far away from the highway, and continuing to get further, large boulders rolling down from where it had passed. It was almost as if the tyrant was scurrying away. Sonny blinked, dumbstruck by the unexpected turn of events. In front of him, the highway was empty, with only the pulsating rift of the gate obstructing its middle section. What the hell? Why did it look as though the tyrant was running from something? Before Sonny could digest the new information, a cold shiver suddenly ran down his spine, and his hair almost stood on end. A sense of danger and fear like he had never experienced before suddenly burst into his mind. Swinging his head to stare at the ocean, his eyes wide, Sonny felt a colossal shadow rising from the depths of the cold water. The waves retreated a few meters back, and then a titanic stone hand suddenly broke the surface and soared into the night sky. The arm of the submerged giant rose above the coastal highway, like a dark tower, easily reaching 20 or 30 meters into the air. And then careened, starting to fall in the direction of the convoy. Chapter 953 Titan. Sonny froze, mesmerized by the harrowing sight of a dark expanse of weathered stone rising from the depths of the ocean. It rose higher and higher, rivers of water flowing down from the numerous grooves and ravines covering the surface of the giant's arm. Due to the scale, it seemed as though the arm was moving deceptively slowly, but he knew that to be an illusion. A single thought formed in Sonny's stunned mind. Goliath. One of the 3 titans that had come to the Antarctic Center. It had to be him. The Whispering Legion was dead, and the winter beast prowled somewhere far to the north. The last one, Stone Giant Goliath, had disappeared without a trace. Army Command had no accurate data on his current location, the last time Sonny had been in contact with them. No wonder if the missing Titan had been traveling through the shallows off the coast of the landmass. It's, it's a damn fallen Titan. A moment later, Sonny suddenly came to his senses, shrugging off the dread and awe of witnessing the enormous creature, or rather one of its limbs. What was the big deal, anyway? The Goliath was a runt as far as Titans were concerned. He was simply a giant stone abomination instead of a sentient force of nature. Even then, Sonny had seen far greater beings before. However, the damned Titan, no matter how he compared to others of its kind, could destroy the convoy with one brush of his finger. Barely suppressing his panic, Sonny stared at the falling hand of the giant, then twisted around and waved at Luster, shouting as loud as he could, "Go, go, go, speed up." If there was one blessing in this dreadful situation, it was that Goliath's aim seemed to be a bit off. If the convoy accelerated, they had a slim chance of shooting underneath the gargantuan arm before it slammed into the highway. Should they end up being just a little bit too slow, at least a couple of vehicles would be instantly flattened by the titanic blow, but stopping meant death. So there was no other choice. The Rhino dashed forward, gaining a bit more speed. Sonny and Nightmare galloped ahead of it, diving into the shadow of the swiftly falling hand and emerging from it on the other side. The APC was just behind them. Sonny's heart was beating wildly as he counted off seconds. The first of the civilian transports appeared behind him, then another and another. Not yet, not yet. Finally, the rear vehicle shot past the gate. A few moments later, Goliath's arm hit the concrete surface of the highway, pulverizing a large swath of it and sending a localized earthquake spreading from the point of impact. Nightmare stumbled, but righted himself a split second later. Some distance behind, the wheels of the rearmost military vehicle momentarily flew into the air, then hit the cracked surface of the road with a screeching sound. Somehow, the driver managed to maintain control of the vehicle and desperately sped forward, hoping to get away from the colossal threat. Made it. Sonny let out a groan, knowing that their narrow escape from death was both temporary and futile. No matter how fast the convoy was moving, they had no hope of outrunning a Titan. Now that Goliath was aiming for them, there was no chance of salvation. Unless something managed to stall the giant for a few minutes, the convoy was doomed. Not fair, not fair, this is not fair. After all they had been through, after everything he had done, this was the end. Sonny felt like howling at the moon in sorrow and anger. Behind them, the enormous hand scraped against the concrete, and then a titanic shape started to rise from the ocean. Goliath was pulling himself out of the cold water, its ugly head emerging from beneath the waves first. Sonny shuddered. The Titan was somewhat humanoid in appearance, but far from resembling a graceful statue. Unlike the magnificent monuments of the Forgotten Shore, Goliath looked more like a small mountain that had come to life than an effigy of a human. The surface of its body was rough and unpolished, like a natural cliff, and its proportions were all wrong. His legs were powerful and stocky, and its torso was massive and asymmetrical, with mounds of stone rising from its back like humps. The giant had 3 arms, each hand possessing a different number of thick, short fingers. His head was like a misshapen hill of brown rock, with 2 cavernous holes gaping in it, drowned by darkness, and a single circular eye set deep in the center of his forehead. At least Sonny thought that it was an eye. The thing was milky white and round, but seemed to be cut of stone, like the rest of the Titan's body. The thought of being gazed upon by the giant eye made him feel a deep sense of primal terror. Or rather, even more of it. Sonny knew that the convoy had no hope of escaping the Titan, but they still had to try. The column sped up as much as it could, the battered vehicles burning through whatever they had left to distance themselves from the terrible monstrosity. The turrets unleashed a barrage of bullets, which hit the weathered stone of the Titan's body in twisting streams. However, their impacts were like mosquito bites to the giant less than. Even mosquitoes could break the skin of their prey, at least. Goliath climbed onto the highway, his massive shape barely fitting between the mountains and the ocean. Countless waterfalls continued to stream off his body, falling down and forming a pool in the obliterated section of the road. The Titan's single eye moved, locking on the escaping convoy. And then, the creature took a step forward. The whole world seemed to tremble from the terrible weight of Goliath's massive foot. Just with this single step, the damned giant covered a lion's share of distance between him and the desperately speeding convoy. Whatever hope of escape Sonny had left was instantly shattered. "Curse you!" He stared at the towering shape of Goliath for a few seconds, his pale face full of dark resentment. Then, Sonny turned Nightmare around and dashed past the convoy, charging directly at the fearsome Titan. Chapter 954, Only Darkness. Because of how close they were to an active gate, the internal communications barely worked across the convoy. However, Sonny had been prepared for something like that. Translating his thoughts to the extraordinary rock, he sent a short message to Luster. "No matter what happens, continue forward and don't slow down. I'll catch up with the convoy later." Hopefully, he shot past the column of vehicles, heading in an entirely wrong direction. What kind of madman would be riding toward a fallen Titan? Sonny only had enough time to notice frightened expressions on the faces of the irregulars, who stared at his flashing silhouette in shock, and then the convoy was somewhere behind him, getting further and further away. The towering shape of Goliath, on the other hand, was drawing closer. Looking at the approaching Titan, Sonny shivered. Can I kill a Titan? He was honestly not sure. One thing he did know, though, was that he wouldn't be able to kill this particular Titan. If Sonny had time to study Goliath, learn his weaknesses, and prepare, then things might have been different. But Army Command knew very little about the stone monstrosity, and so he knew even less. If the two of them fought to the death, there was no question of who would end up dying. Luckily, Sonny did not have to make a heroic last stand. He was no hero and had no plans of being killed anytime soon, and so his goal was not to destroy the colossal creature, he just wanted to slow the big bastard down. If the convoy was given time to get away, there was a good chance that Goliath would not follow them. A bit further north, a long stretch of the highway was built under overhanging cliffs, so the giant's enormous size would become a hindrance. Unless Goliath was ready to smash through many kilometers of solid rock or dive back into the ocean, he was going to have trouble keeping up with the swift vehicles. And even if he was ready to wreck the whole mountain range, that would also slow him down. A few minutes Sonny just had to buy the convoy a few minutes. How the hell do I stop a Titan for a few minutes, though? Nightmare stopped in the middle of the road, dwarfed by the nearing silhouette of Goliath. Sonny stared at the stone giant, shivering as he felt the inhuman gaze fall on him in return. The weight of it was almost palpable, pressing him down like an echo of the crushing. There was a stretch of the quaking highway left between them, but with the creature's colossal height, it was going to be covered in just a few steps. Sonny took a deep breath, and then forced his wildly beating heart to calm down. Jumping off his steed, he walked a small distance forward and stopped, his face full of defiant spitefulness. "You really shouldn't have done this during the night, blockhead." With that, he sent his essence forward. On the slopes of the mountains, and on the dark ribbon of the ocean shore, the mass of shadows moved, coming to life. Then, a thick black chain shot from the darkness, wrapping itself around one of the Titan's arms. It was followed by another and another. Dozens of dark chains flew from the ground, the mountain slope, and the edge of the coast, shackling Goliath's arms and legs. Sonny was utterly focused, his eyes drowned by deep shadow. His essence surged and flowed like a tide, saturating the deep darkness of the polar night. He was burning through all of it without looking back, knowing that nothing but would be enough for the impossible task. Fortunately, if there was one thing he knew all about, it was chains, both literal and metaphorical. He might have not learned how to escape every chain just yet, but he had learned about being bound a long time ago. At first, Goliath did not seem burdened by the shadow chains at all. He continued moving forward, dragging them along. He did not even show a sign of noticing them. However, Sonny was not done. A crooked grin appeared on his pale face, and suddenly it seemed as though the night itself had come to life. Countless chains shot toward the towering Titan, binding his limbs. Where there were dozens, there were now hundreds. Sonny felt as if his brain was on fire. and wasn't quite sure how he was managing to keep this many manifested shadows, shaped, tangible, and strong at the same time. But he was doing it, and more than that. New chains appeared from the darkness every second. Goliath looked like he was carrying a forest of them on his body, anchored to the ground so thoroughly that, finally, the Titan's march slowed down. Just a little bit at first, but then more and more. The towering monstrosity lowered his torso and pushed forward, a hint of irritation appearing in his bearing. But the more he pushed forward, the more the chains held him back. And there were new ones appearing every moment, wrapping themselves around him like snakes. In the end, the Titan came to a stop just a few dozen meters away from Sunny, less than a step, bent low and utterly immobilized. The shadow chains groaned, cracking as if on the verge of snapping, but held. From the side, it looked as if the giant was trying to kneel in front of a defiant ant. Sunny let out a shaky breath, and then swayed slightly, feeling drops of blood falling from his nose. His essence was disappearing at a terrible rate. At this point, he wouldn't be able to sustain the hundreds of shadow chains for long, but no matter how much time that was going to buy, it was already enough. Probably. His mind was somewhat hazy. I think I overdid it this time. And when had the whispers of the sin of solace gotten so loud? Right now, Sunny felt like he could make out what they were saying. No, he definitely could. The cursed sword whispered into his ear, its voice indistinguishable from his own. It only said one word: useless. Sunny's eyes widened slightly. In the next moment, dozens of chains wrapped around one of Goliath's legs snapped with a deafening crack. Oh. The Titan's foot shot forward with astonishing speed and smashed into Sunny with the weight of a mountain. There was the howling of the wind and indescribable pain, but mercifully, it did not last long. Then there was only darkness. Chapter 955, The End. Sunny died. Being dead wasn't too bad, all things considered. More or less every bone in his body was shattered. His rib cage had caved in, and sharp bone fragments were piercing his lungs. His limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, and his skull had cracked. There was excruciating pain, but it went away almost immediately since his spine was broken and his spinal cord was severed. Bone weave had tempered his bones and made them incredibly durable, but everything had its limits. For Sunny, that limit had turned out to be being kicked by a literal mountain, apparently. He could not see anything because his eyes had burst, and could not hear anything because his eardrums had ruptured. The world was dark and silent. It was almost comfortable, if not for the terrible cold. Sunny was very, very cold. Ah, damnation. Could he not just die in peace? You really are a useless piece of outskirt trash. Despite not being able to hear anything, he heard the cold, contemptuous voice. His own voice. Gods, can you shut the hell up? Sunny sent his shadow sense outward and found out that his broken body was laying on the very edge of the dark water, with icy waves washing his blood off the stone shore and licking his skin. No wonder he felt cold. Goliath was nowhere to be seen, but the weakening tremors that shook the world from time to time told him that the Titan was walking away, heading inland. Unable to move, Sunny imagined letting out a sigh. What luck. He might have died, but at least the giant had not stepped on him. His body had stopped just outside the dark waves after flying away and ricocheting off the concrete surface of the highway, too. Otherwise, to add insult to injury, he would have had to drown as well. But since he had not now, it was time to come back to life. Oh, this is going to hurt. Sunny was dead, but of course such trivialities were not going to stop him. He had not spent most of the Antarctica campaign wearing the undying chain without a reason after all. Undying enchantment description. The wearer cannot die. As long as he had essence to spare, death was just a temporary condition for Sunny. It was no different from having his head cut off in the Red Colosseum, and he had survived that debacle without too much trouble. Simply being unable to die for a few minutes was not going to save him, sadly. Back then, Sunny had been healed by Elias before running out of essence, but now there was no one to help him. As soon as he burned through his essence, he would inevitably die. Well, I'll just help myself then. Sunny summoned the runes. He did not have eyes anymore, and yet he was still able to perceive them, somehow. It was both strange and logical, explaining how Cassie had been able to communicate with the spell all that time. Finding the dying wish in the list of his memories, he concentrated on it and read the description of the transcendent charm's soul enchantment. Death wish enchantment description. Those who witness the wielder of this memory are compelled. Friends to be inspired, foes to seek the wielder out. The power of the memory grows the more enemies they give the gift of death, and can be consumed to heal the wielder's wounds. Death charge, 1,000 flush 1,000. Sunny had not been idle since coming to Antarctica. He had saturated the counter of the dying wish a long time ago by slaughtering countless nightmare creatures across the Antarctic center. Now it was finally time to use that hidden ace. Feeling his essence running dry and a numbing fog enveloping his mind, Sunny activated the healing enchantment. Instantly, there was a change. A furious flood of power rushed into his broken body, repairing it. His eardrums were restored. His liquefied eyes slowly started to coalesce back into solid shape. His fractured bones assembled themselves from hundreds of small fragments. The severed sections of his spinal cord connected back together. Arg, crap. The pain was back, sending him into a violent convulsion. Sunny bit his tongue hard enough to feel the salty taste of blood, but a moment later, that wound, too, was healed. The agony of it all was nothing short of exquisite. See, curse it. But it was all good. Pain was good. Pain meant that he was alive, or at least coming back to life. It was its absence that was frightening. A full charge of the powerful transcendent memory was enough to bring his body back from being utterly devastated. But the process was not instantaneous. Even with blood weave helping, it took some time. Sunny had no choice but to endure and wait. He was no stranger to agony anyway. At some point, he regained his vision. Raising his head weakly, Sunny looked at himself through the veil of tears. What he saw made him feel disheartened. The undying chain was all but gone. The bleak steel of his armor was shattered and mangled to the point of being unrecognizable. A few pieces of it were bent at sharp angles and pierced his flesh, slowing down the process of healing. Sunny stared at the bloody mess that was his body for a few moments, then thought that he should probably dismiss the armor. However, he did not need to. Almost at the same moment, the undying chain suddenly shone with soft radiance, and then disintegrated into a whirlwind of white sparks. The brilliant sparks danced around him for a few seconds, caressing his skin before disappearing without a trace, forever. The familiar voice of the spell whispered into his ear, "Your memory has been destroyed." Sunny dropped his head back into the water. Thank you. The undying chain had held long enough for the healing power of the dying wish to bring him back from the doors of death, refusing to succumb to the terrible damage before he was safely on his way to being healed, as if on purpose. True to its name to the very end. It was sort of poetic. I guess dying makes one sentimental. What the hell was he thinking about? It was just a suit of armor, an armor-type memory. Memories did not have thoughts, aspirations, and feelings. Well, most didn't. Turning his head slightly, Sunny stared at the beautiful jade shape of the Sin of Solace, which was laying on the stones a few steps away from him. His eyes darkened a little. So it was you, all that time, messing with my mind and calling me names? The moonlight glinted on the pristine white blade. Everything was silent for a few moments, and then Sunny's own voice answered, full of disdain. Took you long enough to realize, as expected of an uneducated rat. Sunny gritted his teeth and stifled the desire to dismiss the damned sword immediately. He had already lost his armor, and leaving himself without a weapon would not be a very good decision. Ignoring the insidious whispers, Sunny let out a pained groan and then stood up with a stagger. He was all but naked, terribly fatigued, and suffering from extreme essence exhaustion. But he was also undoubtedly not dead. Sunny came back to life. Chapter 956, Follower. Sunny stood on the shore of the ocean, shivering and considering if he should fall down and take a long, relaxing rest in the cold water. His reserves of essence were utterly spent, and with it came the sickening feeling of fragility and weakness. Awakened experienced a form of backlash when burning through all of their essence, but it was only a little bit harmful. The weakness would pass, and there would be no long-term harm done. He just had to weather the immediate consequence. The more concerning aspect of the situation was that he did not even have enough essence to summon a single memory. Looking down at the threadbare rags of his once pristine black bodysuit, Sunny sighed. For now, that was all that separated him from the bitter cold and the chilling winds of Antarctica. I need to get back to the convoy. Trying to get his tired mind to work properly, Sunny hesitated for a moment. But first, I need to check on Nightmare. The stallion was nowhere to be seen, so he was afraid of what had happened to his steed. The runes were still shimmering in the air in front of Sunny, so he turned his attention back to them. Death charge, 0v quantum 1000. The charge of the dying wish was completely spent, but it had done its job. The undying chain was gone. Turning away from the list of memories with a sigh, he looked at the status of his shadows. The runes describing Nightmare shone as always, so the black steed was not destroyed. Then where is he? Sunny frowned, then softly hit himself on the forehead, remembering that he could simply check his innate connection to the shadow. Without wasting any time, he reached inward and tried to sense it within his soul. Soon, Sunny felt Nightmare's presence. The connection was not really meant to share information, but he could still tell that the black steed was nearby, and in the middle of a battle the battle did not seem dire or dangerous, though. The stallion was most likely dealing with stray nightmare creatures that could have attacked Sunny while he was still healing. Good, then. We can get away from here as soon as he is finished. Sunny swayed a little, then glanced at his four shadows, who were all staring at him with different expressions. The happy shadow was beside itself, but strangely the other three were also showing some degree of uncharacteristic positivity. Even the gloomy one appeared somewhat relieved. He grinned. What did you think that a mere titan would be enough to get rid of me? Dream on. With that, Sunny looked north, wondering how long it would take to catch up with the convoy, then took a couple steps forward and leaned down to pick up the Sin of Solace. That damned thing. The closer his fingers got to the jade hilt, the more it seemed as though the cursed sword was smiling ominously. Behind you. Sunny scoffed, as if I would be gullible enough to. At that moment, a swift shape shot through the darkness and collided with him. A tearing pain pierced Sunny's side, and he was sent flying into the water. Hitting the dark surface with a pained scream, he scraped his hands on the cold stones beneath and rolled, jumping to his feet a split second later. A handful of sharp rocks flew in the direction of the unknown attacker, meant to slow whoever it was down. However, the creature was still standing in the spot where Sunny had been a few moments ago, staring at him with inhuman eyes. Sunny staggered. Briefly looking down, he saw that a sizable chunk of flesh was torn out of his side. Blood weave had stemmed the bleeding, but the wound still looked gruesome. Then, he glanced back at the bastard who had bitten him. The creature looked vaguely familiar. It was short, barely reaching Sunny's abdomen, with dark skin and bone plates covering its scrawny body like a suit of light armor. The damned goblin did not look too formidable, but it had a wide mouth full of sharp, triangular teeth. It was also missing 2 fingers on its right hand. Sunny blinked a couple of times, remembering a tiny imp that he had once failed to finish off. The wretch had grown a lot since their last meeting, however. It was still on the smaller side. Looking up, he noticed a lump of bleeding flesh in the abomination's mouth. His face contorted in anger. Sunny clenched his fists and opened his mouth. But before he could say anything, the scavenger seemed to grin spitefully, and then swallowed the lump of flesh with a look of pure hatred written on its ugly face. Sunny's eyes widened. You wicked little shit. He had let the imp go once, but the bastard did not know his luck. That's great. I'll just kill him now. Full of fury, Sunny took a step forward, but then staggered. The world suddenly turned hazy, and his head spun. What the? His side somehow both growing numb and burning with terrible pain. His body felt even weaker than before. Slowly looking down, he saw a strangely familiar black liquid flowing out of the gruesome wound. No, it was his blood, which was not stopping. For some reason, the blood had simply turned black. His face paled. Black venom. How did he get poisoned with black venom? Sonny froze for a split second. No way. The abomination in front of him was a scavenger, a type of nightmare creature that inherited traits of that which it consumed. Had he feasted on the flesh of slain black tongues that the convoy had left floating in the mountain lake? Had the little bastard been following the convoy all that time, stuffing himself with all the corpses and carcasses that they had left behind? Growing and waiting for a chance to avenge himself on Sonny. Suddenly he wanted to laugh. Bastard, you waited all that time, only to deliver yourself into my hands now. Sonny took another step forward, commanding the shadows to wrap themselves around his body. Before he could, however, the scavenger suddenly dashed forward with tremendous speed, and a dreadful blow crashed into Sonny's abdomen. With the wind knocked out of him, he was thrown back and fell on his back. A split second later, the abomination was on top of Sonny, two unexpectedly powerful hands wrapped around his neck, strangling him. A vicious, hateful snarl escaped from between the creature's bloodied teeth. Sonny's head was pushed beneath the surface of the waves, and ice-cold water instantly filled his mouth and nose. He tried to push the scavenger off, but his body was too weak to resist the furious fiend. Wait. Before Sonny could come up with a single coherent thought, his consciousness started to fade, and a dangerous darkness encroached on his mind. And then he got angry too. Chapter 957, Tooth and Nail. Why is this happening to me twice in a row? What is this crap? Sonny was being strangled and drowned with his mutilated side on fire because of seawater getting into the ugly wound. The hateful scavenger had turned out to be astonishingly strong for his demure size, or maybe it was Sonny who was too weak. He was utterly drained of essence, still recovering from being stomped on by a titan, and had a powerful toxin coursing through his veins on top of everything, after all. In any case, no matter how desperately he tried to shake the little bastard off his body, it was all in vain. Arg. The thought of surviving an encounter with a fallen titan, only to be killed by this pathetic waste of an abomination, made him feel bitter and slighted, especially because the damned gremlin was barely half his size. Just give up. Your life is meaningless anyway. Feeling his consciousness starting to slip, Sonny tried to snarl. Shut the hell up. The sin of solace remained silent for a moment and then laughed. It is amusing how desperately you are trying to survive, knowing that all that is waiting for you is a lifetime of being a slave. That was the last drop, no. Actually, being ambushed by the odious little goblin had been the last drop. After months of suffering setback after setback and enduring the stress of guiding men through a disastrous war campaign, having to restrain himself to project the image of a capable and composed leader, Sonny had finally had enough of it. Suddenly, he was very, very angry. He was positively furious. Sonny was furious at the world itself, but since the spiteful gremlin was the only creature near him, the bastard was going to have to be the sole target of his anger. Come here, you wretched waif. Letting go of the two thin but surprisingly strong hands that were currently strangling him, Sonny reached up and found the creature's face. The scavenger immediately tried to bite his fingers off, and a sharp pain pierced Sonny's right thumb. Luckily, the scrawny abomination was no Goliath. Bone Weave might have surrendered to the titanic blow of the giant's stone foot, but it did not give in to the scavenger's unreasonably sharp teeth, so Sonny had kept his finger, even though it got cruelly mangled. Not even noticing the pain, he grabbed the hateful gremlin's face and then pressed his left thumb into the creature's eye as hard as he could. That, at least, got a reaction. Shocked, the scavenger recoiled, and even if it was only for a moment, his grip on Sonny's neck weakened. That was all he needed. Shifting beneath the abomination, Sonny managed to bend his knee, insert it between their bodies, and then throw the bastard away. The gluttonous goblin might have been far stronger than he had any business being, but he was still comparatively light. His scrawny body flew away, landing back on the stone shore. Where do you think you're going? I'm not finished with you yet, damned pest. Rising from the water, Sonny sucked in a hoarse breath and then glared at the scavenger with bloodshot, murderous eyes. Come here. The spiteful creature was happy to oblige. He jumped back to his feet and lunged forward, but then stumbled and grabbed his abdomen with a confused look. Sonny grinned. "What? Do you have a stomachache?" That was probably blood weave doing its thing. Sonny's blood was not really poisonous, but it had a disturbing propensity of trying to return to its source when separated from it. So, swallowing a chunk of his flesh was almost like swallowing a handful of metal shavings and then walking to stand in front of a powerful magnet. The bastard had to be in a world of pain. No, not yet, he isn't. Sonny dashed toward the vile goblin and used the momentary lapse in their battle to shift his vision and get a look at his enemy's soul. What he saw surprised him. The scavenger, who had started as a tiny pipsqueak of a nightmare creature, had not only grown many times its size physically, but also spiritually. Judging by the hideous darkness spreading through his soul, he was now a fallen demon. Sonny was pretty sure that the pathetic abomination he had failed to kill at LO49 was both of a lesser rank and a lower class, so it was a bit startling. Well, no matter. He'll die all the same. The two of them clashed at the edge of the water. The scavenger was strong, fast, and vicious, but Sonny was augmented by 4 shadows. Sadly, the augmentation of the shadows was not set in stone, instead enhancing his own physical state. And since his physical state was currently at the rock bottom, Sonny was still far away from being able to perform at his peak. Weakness multiplied by 5 might have transformed into a kind of strength, but not the sort he was used to. Still, he was both bigger and stronger than the feral gremlin, even if the gap was not as large as it was supposed to be. The creature only had a slight advantage in speed. Wishing to crush the bastard with his own 2 hands, Sonny tried to grapple the scavenger and bring him to the ground, but the hateful imp managed to slip from his grasp at the last moment and lashed out with his maimed hand, delivering a vicious blow right into Sonny's wounded side. The explosion of pain made stars appear in his eyes. A strange wheezing sound escaped from between the abomination's sharp teeth, sounding almost like horse laughter. "You wretch!" Hissing, Sonny caught the abomination's arm and twisted it. The familiar sound of snapping bones made a smile appear on his face, but a moment later, it was replaced by a pained grimace. Without skipping a beat after having his arm broken, the scavenger sunk his teeth into Sonny's forearm, making more blood splatter on the rocks and more venom to enter his system. God damn it. Livid, Sonny slapped the scrawny fiend across the head, sending him flying away. Even before the abomination landed, he was already closing in, prepared to annihilate the little bastard. However, the scavenger just happened to fall on a very particular spot on the stone shore. His maimed hand ended up mere centimeters away from the hilt of Sin of Solace, which was still laying on the wet rocks. The familiar voice laughed coldly. Well, would you look at that? What a turn of events. Before Sonny could reach the evil goblin, the creature hurriedly reached forward, grabbed the cursed sword, and swung it fiercely in Sonny's direction. Chapter 958, A Series of Unfortunate Events. Sonny was too close to dodge the sudden strike, and the scavenger was too quick to let him. Even though the Sin of Solace was longer than his whole body, the little fiend managed to swing it fast enough to leave the enemy no time to retreat. What the hell? Knowing that the jade blade would easily cut him in half, or at least deliver a devastating wound, Sonny stared at the deadly white blur as it approached his torso. The time seemed to have slowed down. Is this a joke? Without having to do anything, he simply dismissed the Sin of Solace. Instead of the lethal touch of the perfect jade, his skin was washed by a scattering of white sparks. The gremlin blinked in confusion, and then awkwardly clenched his fists, as if trying to understand where the sword he had been just holding went. In the next moment, Sonny kicked him in the chest, sending the abomination flying again. Judging by the satisfying crunch he felt, the plate of bone armor on the scavenger's chest was broken, and very likely a few of his ribs too. Best of all, the damned sword finally stopped talking. The wounded fiend bounced off the rocks, rolled a few meters, and then jumped to his feet. He did not seem too wounded to not be able to continue the fight, and more than eager to. However, his expression was slightly pained, and before doing anything, the gremlin hit his head a few times. Sonny smiled. It seemed that the annoying whispers had done a number on the scavenger's mind as well. Now, all that was left was to finish the little menace off, preferably without losing any more pieces of flesh or getting even more poisoned than he already was. Sonny just started to consider the best and most painful way to kill the scavenger. But at that moment, a beautiful sound reached his ears. It was the ringing of adamantine hooves that was approaching them from somewhere further up the road. A nasty grin appeared on his face. "Oh, you are so done now, bastard." Nightmare had obliterated his foes and was coming back to assist his master. The scavenger seemed to understand the meaning of the ringing, too. He hesitated, staring at Sonny with an expression of burning hatred. Time to die. Then something changed. The expression on the ugly face of the vicious gremlin shifted, turning into one of indescribable fear. Moving his head, the little fiend stared at something behind Sonny's back, but there was nothing there. Sonny wanted to scoff. Does this cretin really think that I will fall for the oldest trick in the book? I wrote that damn book, fool, except for the ocean. Then again, Sonny had already neglected to look behind himself once today, which had led to his current pitiful state. Suddenly, a chill ran down his spine. With all four shadows wrapped around his body, Sonny could not see what was happening behind him. Gritting his teeth and knowing that he would regret it, he briefly glanced at the dark surface of the water. The ocean was just as it had been a minute ago, and no horror was lunging at him from the cold waves. No, no, no. By the time he looked back, the scavenger was already gone. Sonny did not know where the little bastard had disappeared to, but he could not see any trace of him. It was as if the scavenger had never been here at all. A stunned expression appeared on Sonny's face. Did he really slip away from me? Again? He opened his mouth in disbelief. Damnation! Infuriated, Sonny kicked the nearest rock and then spun, hoping against reason to find the hateful gremlin somehow. He could not have gotten too far away, or hidden too well. There was no telling just what sort of powers the hateful abomination had absorbed by devouring countless nightmare creatures, though. The scavenger was thoroughly gone. I can't believe it. Curse that damned wretch. Gritting his teeth, Sonny sent his shadow sense outward, reaching as far as he could in hope of discovering a hiding goblin. He did not sense a scrawny shadow of the fiend anywhere. He did sense something else, however. Suddenly, Sonny felt very cold. Slowly turning around, he looked at the ocean again. The surface of the undulating waves was unchanged, but somewhere beneath it, at the very edge of his senses, he could feel shadows moving across the ocean floor, drawing closer and closer. Dozens, no, hundreds and hundreds of them, all heading toward a single point. Hem. Backing away, Sonny gulped. Was the little wretch not faking after all? What could have frightened the scavenger so much that he had chosen to abandon his attempt at murdering Sonny? I better not find out. Without a drop of essence in his cores and black venom coursing through his veins, Sonny did not feel particularly keen to learn what horrors were approaching him from beneath the waves. He took a few more steps away, and then turned around, noticing a familiar shape. Nightmare appeared in his view, galloping across the shattered surface of the highway. Following Sonny's command, the black stallion flashed past him without ever slowing down. As he did, Sonny grabbed the hook of the saddle and pulled himself up, jumping on the back of the galloping steed. Together they dashed away from the water, heading north as fast as they could. Throughout all of it, Sonny never looked back. The feeling of cold dread he felt from the approaching shadows. It was eerily familiar. To hell with this, to hell with it all. This is too damn much for one godforsaken day. The silhouette of the dark courser and his half-naked battered rider disappeared behind a bend of the mountain slope, and just a few seconds later, the dark waters parted, and the first of the eerie visitors stepped from the water onto the shore. Chapter 959, Lonesome Rider. Sonny was riding north through the bitter cold of the polar night, shivering in his raggedy, tattered bodysuit. The coastal highway stretched forward, strangely silent and empty. From time to time, he encountered bleeding carcasses of slain nightmare creatures that lay on the concrete, staring into the darkness with glassy eyes. Those were the only signs left behind by the passing of the convoy. The rest of the abominations must have been pulled away by it, rushing in pursuit of the small column of vehicles that gave Sonny a chance to catch his breath. I am tired. Now that the thrill of the battle was gone, he found himself in a somber mood. The cold, dark, and desolate landscape of the Antarctic Center was only adding to the gloom. Looking ahead, Sonny winced as he rocked in Nightmare's saddle. His wounds were hurting, and the lethal toxin was still trying to kill him from the inside. Most people would have been dead already, but blood weave was slowly overcoming the black venom. Sonny was still bleeding from the torn bite wounds on his side and his forearm, though. His thumb was also a mess. Since he had not encountered anything capable of making him bleed in a long while, that was a bit disconcerting. However, there was very little that Sonny could do. He had a mundane medkit stored inside the covetous coffer, but lacked the essence to summon it. He could not summon an armor to protect himself from the cold for the same reason as well. After being completely exhausted, essence was slow to return to the vast reservoirs of his cores. What little he had received from dismissing the sin of solace was almost instantly absorbed by his essence-starved body. Until his flesh was saturated, at least to a small degree, he was not going to be able to summon any memory. It was not too bad, though. The more of the rejuvenating essence returned to his body, the better he was able to resist the cold, and the stronger blood weave became. Slowly but surely, the feeling of sickening weakness permeating his whole being was receding. Then, a small trickle of essence flowed into his cores. Finally, Sonny commanded Nightmare to stop and then dismounted. He knelt on the concrete for a minute or two, steadily breathing in and out and thinking about what memory he should summon first. He was cold and required armor to protect him from both the elements and the enemies, but he also felt very uncomfortable without a weapon. His wounds needed to be tended to, and the memory of ice was another worthy candidate. Eventually he sighed. Nightmare can be my weapon for now. With that, Sonny summoned the covetous coffer. Opening the metal chest, he took out a medkit and awkwardly applied the clotting agent to his wounds, then plastered the sealing patches on top of them. After that, he reached deep into the cavernous storage space of the coffer, searched for a bit, and pulled out a military coat. Sonny stared at the brass buttons on the coat for a few moments, then put it on and raised the collar, hoping to save himself from the chilling wind. That should do it for now. Climbing back into the saddle, he sent his steed forward. Nightmare went slowly at first, so as not to disturb his master's wounds too much. They traveled in silence for some time. Eventually, Sonny recovered enough essence to summon another memory, choosing the cruel sight this time. He had considered calling upon the sin of solace, but then decided against it. His mood was already dark, and listening to the damned sword was not going to improve it one bit. Plus, with the undying chain gone, his mental defenses were not as good as they had been. Sonny scowled when he remembered the loss of the transcendent armor and hurried to throw the bitter thoughts out of his mind. It seemed that after subjecting him to all kinds of misfortune, Fated had finally decided to bestow Sonny with some luck. He had not encountered a single nightmare creature while traversing a long stretch of the highway. Eventually, though, that luck was bound to run out. Looking through the eyes of one of the shadows, which was scouting ahead, Sonny frowned. There was a dark mass of moving bodies blocking the road about a kilometer further north. The concrete was littered with corpses, and the abominations were feasting on the flesh of their fallen brethren, devouring them in a nauseating mess of squelching noises. As Sonny looked past the morbid feast, his eyes darkened. Soon adamantine hooves rang on the concrete, and a nightmarish rider plunged into the mass of abominations. His steed stomped and tore them apart, and the shining spear of the rider himself flashed, making stark shadows dance on the surface of the highway and streams of evaporating blood fountain into the cold air. It did not take Sonny long to eviscerate the scavenging nightmare creatures. By then he had recovered enough essence to channel it into the cruel sight, and by the time the short and brutal battle ended, he still had enough left to summon the mantle of the underworld. Finally, he was not cold anymore. His mood, however, only grew darker. Out there behind the mass of dead nightmare creatures, both those who had been killed before he arrived and those he killed himself, the familiar shape of one of the civilian transports could be seen on the road, standing motionlessly. The lights of the vehicle were gone, and its frame was littered by deep gouges. Several large holes revealed the dark interior. Carcasses of the abominations were piled around the transport, especially high, as if there had been a desperate fight around it. Sunny sighed, then walked over and climbed inside, expecting to see the worst. However, there were no human bodies littering the interior. There was no blood either, just emptiness and shards of broken glass. What the hell happened here? He lingered for a few moments, then returned outside and jumped into the saddle with a deep frown on his pale face. Full of tension, Sunny sent Nightmare galloping north once again. This time, his posture was full of a sense of urgency. Chapter 960, Erebus Field. About an hour later, Sunny reached the spot where the convoy was supposed to leave the highway and turn inland, scaling the mountains once again to eventually reach Erebus Field. Of all the siege capitals in the Antarctic Center, only the first and the largest one, Falcon Scott, was situated near water. Even then, the actual port was a separate and solitary fortress connected to the city above it by a network of industrial elevators. The rest of the human strongholds were built away from the ocean, on the outskirts of the mountains. So, the last stretch of the way was going to take the convoy away from the coast, if they continued on the route Sunny had planned for them, of course. He had killed a few more nightmare creatures while trying to catch up with his men, and the corpses he had encountered seemed fresher as of late. From what Sunny could tell, the column was not too far ahead of him now. If he was lucky, he might even be able to rejoin the convoy before reaching Erebus Field. The siege capital had to be surrounded by a ring of active battle engagements, so Sunny really hoped to accompany the refugees through that mess. No time to waste then. He commanded Nightmare to turn east. Not long after they started to ascend the mountains, the snowfall seemed to pick up, making it harder to see. There was something strange about that snow, though. What is this smell? Frowning, Sunny raised a hand and caught a few snowflakes on his palm. While he could see in the dark, differentiating colors that way was not his strongest suit. Sunny could instantly tell that something was wrong, though, because the white snowflakes did not contrast against the onyx metal of his gauntlet nearly as much as they should have. In fact, they were not white at all. He tilted his head a little, then smeared the snowflakes across his palm. What was left behind was a trail of black soot. It's ash. Looking up at the sky, he scowled. The strong snowfall was no snowfall at all. Instead, it was raining ash. Countless gray flakes fell from high above, dancing in the wind as they slowly obscured the world in a thick fog. That can't be good. Full of bad premonitions, Sunny sent Nightmare into a gallop. They moved deeper into the mountains, following the twisted road. By now, Bloodweave had mostly dealt with the toxin, and his wounds were already healing. His essence was slowly being replenished as well. So overall, Sunny was in relatively good shape, not enough to face something truly dreadful yet, but well on the way. Where the hell is my convoy? Just as he thought that, the scouting shadows noticed something ahead. Just short of the highest point of the nearest mountain pass, protected from the wind by tall cliffs, a group of battered vehicles was parked in a circle, with tired soldiers standing guard around it. He noticed Bell sitting on the roof of one of the transports, holding a sword in his hand. A sense of profound relief grasped Sunny's heart. They're fine. He let out a heavy breath and asked Nightmare to go faster. A few minutes later, the figure of an infernal rider clad in fearsome black armor entered the circle of light surrounding the parked convoy. The soldiers flinched and raised their rifles, aiming at the frightening apparition. Sunny raised a hand. "Don't shoot, bastards. What the hell is this? A mutiny." The soldiers blinked a couple of times, staring at him with wide eyes. Then, someone yelled, "It's the captain. He's back. Thank the gods. Someone tell the devils." There was no need to inform the irregulars, though. Bell was the first one to notice him, and just a few moments later, the whole cohort emerged from the camp to meet him. Sunny jumped off the back of Nightmare, patted the stallion on the shoulder, and then dismissed him. Then he turned to his people. Kim was the first one to speak. "Captain, you're alive. I mean, of course you are. That rock of yours would have disappeared if you died." Luster grinned. "See, I told you." Quentin glanced at him, then nodded with a smile. "We shouldn't have doubted the captain, indeed. But, to be honest, sir, none of us believed that you would manage to stop a fallen titan, let alone live to tell the tale. All by yourself, no less. That is simply incredible. How did you even survive?" Sonny stared at him blankly for a few moments, then said evenly, "I didn't." As the members of the cohort looked at him with wide eyes, he scratched the back of his head and added, "Being dead was not all it's cracked up to be, though. So I walked it off. Anyway, I found the empty transport on the highway." What the hell happened? The irregulars glanced at each other. Dorn sighed, then pointed to the convoy. "It broke down in the middle of the road, sir. We had to stop and transfer the refugees to the other 3 vehicles. The abominations did not let us do it in peace, of course. It was a hell of a fight, but in the end we managed to get everyone loaded up safely, broke through the crowd of nightmare creatures, and fled. We lost a couple of soldiers, but none of the civilians were seriously hurt." Sonny let out a heavy sigh. So more people died. He closed his eyes for a moment. "What is the situation now, then?" Dorn's face darkened. "The remaining transports are in bad shape and severely overloaded, sir. I don't think that they'll be able to travel for much longer." That was to be expected. Sonny waved a hand. "Are they going to make it to Erebus Field at least? And, by the way, why did you stop? Is there a large number of nightmare creatures between us and the city gate?" None of the members of the cohort answered, which was strange in and of itself. What made Sonny really anxious, though, were the fallen expressions on their faces. What? Dorn remained silent for a bit, then turned his head in the direction of the mountain pass. "It would be easier if we just showed you, sir." They walked through the camp and then crested the slope of the pass. From there, Sonny had a clear view of Erebus Field, which was supposed to be half a dozen kilometers further north. Supposed to. With a frozen expression, Sonny looked through the falling ash at the dreadful sight below. His sunken eyes were hidden by deep, dark shadows. Curse it all. Erebus Field was no more. Chapter 961, Sandcastles. The dark skies were shrouded by a veil of slowly falling ash. Far below the mountain pass, illuminated by a foreboding red glow, a vast metropolis lay in ruins. The shattered buildings were drowning in rivers of lava, and a terrible conflagration was raging across the devastated land, devouring what little was left of the once thriving city. Above the scene of devastation, the dark shape of Mount Erebus was wreathed in smoke. A flood of molten rock was flowing down its slopes, glowing through the haze. The walls of the city were breached, and uncountable hordes of nightmare creatures were prowling in the ruins, some bathing in the flames, some avoiding it. Looking down with a dead expression on his pale, tired face, Sonny found himself momentarily unable to feel anything. Doesn't make any sense. Erebus Field had been one of the most prominent cities in Antarctica, famous for its geothermal energy farms, fertile soil, and warmth. It had been home to tens of millions of people even before becoming an evacuation center. The local government branch was supposed to have the volcano well under control. Even if all the safety systems they had in place were to suffer a cataclysmic failure, the city had possessed formidable fortifications long before being converted into a siege capital. With those in place and a whole division of the First Army working on reinforcing the defensive infrastructure, as well as the presence of hundreds of awakened and more than a few masters, Erebus Field simply could not succumb to something as mundane as a volcanic eruption. How did this happen? Sonny was supposed to guide the convoy to this stronghold, deliver the refugees to the authorities, rendezvous with Davis and his cohort of irregulars, and then resume acting in his usual capacity as the captain of a fast-response combat unit. Instead, the city was gone. Davis and his people were nowhere to be found, and the responsibility of caring for the convoy of defenseless civilians was still pressing heavily on his shoulders. If anything, that weight had only become more burdensome. He was at his wits' end. With a sigh, Sonny rubbed his face and then sat down on a nearby boulder. His eyes were still glued to the horrible scene below. He was simply unable to look away. The members of the cohort stood awkwardly around him, keeping silent. Sonny remembered that he was meant to be projecting an image of confidence as their leader, but was too rattled and angry to care. After a while, Bell cleared his throat. "We are awaiting your orders, sir." Quentin glanced at the swordsman reproachfully, then sighed. "None of us really knows what to do. The mood among the civilians is pretty dark as well. Everyone is a bit shaken, I think. We did check the maps, though. The next siege capital is to the northeast of here, over the mountains, about 300 kilometers away. Miss Beth and Professor Obel are currently searching for a good route. Sonny silently shook his head. There's no point. Siege capitals seem to be crumbling like sand castles these days. Who says that the next one will still be there by the time we arrive, if we even make it? The irregulars glanced at each other with uncomfortable expressions. After a poignant pause, Kim asked, "What? What should we do then, sir?" Sonny let out a heavy sigh, then looked north. After a few moments of silence, he said, "Go to Falcon Scott. That is our best hope. Even if all other siege capitals fall, it will stand. It is the most fortified, and the First Army's presence is the strongest there. Most importantly, that is where St. Tyrus is. As long as she is defending the north, we'll be safe there." Sonny did not add that if something capable of taking Sky Tide out appeared, all of them would be better off committing suicide. Once saints started to die, mortals like them had no hope of making it out, really. He also did not mention that there were another 2,000 kilometers between them and Falcon Scott, twice as much as they had barely survived to get to Erebus Field from LO-49. Everyone here knew that, since the cohort had started this damned campaign at the distant northern stronghold. Returning to Falcon Scott would complete the calamitous circle. Granted, the situation would be slightly different as they moved further north. Since that was where the First Army had first established its presence, the territories between Erebus Field and Falcon Scott were far better entrenched than the desolate regions in the south, where the army had come last. There would be established evacuation corridors, or at least remnants of them. Supply depots, fortified outposts, well-maintained roads. Perhaps they would even meet friendly forces on the way. Come to think of it, I should probably contact Army Command as soon as possible to get detailed information about the big picture. The timing would be tricky, since the convoy was currently in a dire situation, with numerous nightmare creatures flooding the area. Sending even one irregular into the dream realm would diminish their ability to defend themselves, but it was better than remaining blind. His people needed sleep anyway. Sonny lingered for a few moments, then said, "Leave me for a bit. I need to think. Oh, make sure that the transports are as ready to move as they can be, while you're at it." He doubted that it would be safe to remain near the fallen city for long. The irregulars nodded, then backed off and headed toward the convoy's temporary camp. Left alone, Sonny forced himself to look away from the ruins of Erebus Field and stared up at the sky, which was dark and obscured by clouds of ash. Damn it. The 3 remaining civilian transports were overloaded and on the verge of irrevocably breaking down. Military vehicles should still be operational, but Sergeant Gear had probably run out of ammunition by now. What the hell am I supposed to do? As Sonny watched the sky, a black dot appeared above him. At first he thought that it was just another flake of ash, but the dot moved too swiftly to be one. It dove down, slowly growing as it drew closer. A few seconds later, a black bird landed on a rock near him. It had glossy black feathers, smart round eyes, and a sharp beak that reminded him of spire messengers. With mild surprise, Sonny recognized it as a crow. He knew that one, at least. Birds were a little bit less extinct than mammals, so even though they were a rare sight in the outskirts, there were some. They usually did not last long, though. However, why is there a crow in Antarctica? Just as he thought it, the crow opened its beak and cawed. Its caws sounded terribly like words. Sonny. Sonny. Chapter 962, Reaper's Crow. As soon as the strange crow appeared, Sonny was ready to kill it. Summoning the Moonlight Shard would have only taken a split second, and a swift strike of his armored fist was going to do the job just as well. If it was an ordinary bird, of course, which he seriously doubted. He did not expect the crow to speak, though. Sonny. Sonny. Is it calling my name? Sonny temporarily postponed his plans of killing the crow and stared at it for a bit. The crow tilted its head and stared back. Sonny. He blinked, then shifted his vision and looked into the bird's soul. Sonny expected to see an orb of repulsive darkness, but what he saw instead were 2 radiant cores. The crow was an awakened monster, however. It was not a nightmare creature. Is it an echo, or am I losing my mind again? He hesitated for a little while, then said cautiously, Yes, I am Sunny. The bird jumped closer with a satisfied look, shook its entire body to get rid of flakes of ash clinging to the black feathers, and then cawed again. Jet, Jet. A spark of hope ignited in Sunny's heart. He studied the crow some more, then leaned closer and whispered, "Did Master Jet send you?" The small monster bobbed its head up and down several times. Jet, send. Sunny closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. So she did not forget about me after all, huh? The crow appeared to be Soul Reaper's echo, which he had sent to find Sunny. It felt nice to be remembered. However, he was not sure how the blackbird was supposed to help him, if that was Jet's intention at all. Was it simply a messenger to deliver new orders? Someone to guide him to Davis and his cohort of elite assassins? He hesitated for a moment. Why did Master Jet send you to find me? The small monster jumped a couple of times. Crow, help. So it was not just a messenger. The echo was meant to assist him, somehow. Sunny tried not to get too excited. How are you going to help me? Are you going to lead me to Davis? The blackbird silently shook its head, making Sunny frown. Why not? The crow tilted its head. Davies dead. Sunny let out a heavy sigh. So pride was gone. His men probably hadn't made it out of Erebus Field either. He did not know the cold man too well, but the loss of a full cohort of irregulars still hit him hard. Not to mention that Sunny's hopes of linking up with another powerful master were crushed. From what he knew, that was the first serious casualty the irregulars had suffered from the start of the campaign. His information was outdated, though. Who says that any of them are still alive? The irregulars, and especially their captains, were elites among elites. But with how unreasonably dreadful the chain of nightmares was turning out to be, at least in the Antarctic Center, there were no guarantees. Hell, he himself had all but died just a few hours ago. At least Soul Reaper was still out there, somewhere. A dark grimace appeared on Sunny's face. Looking back at the small bird, he asked in a dubious tone, "How are you supposed to help me then?" The crow flapped its wings. "Crow, show." Sunny frowned. "Show what?" The bird stared at him for a few moments, then cawed again. "Crow, show." Then it added, "Sani, follow." It wants me to follow it? He did not have too much trust in the mere awakened monster's abilities. But if Master Jet had sent it, then there had to be a good reason. In any case, Sunny did not have too many choices. Although he did not want to think it aloud, the convoy's situation was more or less hopeless. With failing vehicles and an ocean of nightmare creatures surrounding them, the chances that he would be able to keep the refugees alive were not too high. Sunny sighed, then nodded. "All right. We'll follow you. Just give me a bit of time to get my people on the road." The crow stared at him for a bit, then flopped its wings again. "Hurry. You don't need to remind me." Standing up, Sunny descended toward the convoy's camp and ordered everyone to prepare for departure. Soon, the column of vehicles left its temporary shelter and followed a narrow mountain road that circled the former Erebus Field from a good distance. The crow flew above them, guiding the convoy deeper into the mountains. The bird had turned out to be an amazing scout. Not only was it able to notice swarms of nightmare creatures from high above long before they could threaten the column, but it was also smart enough to lead Sunny and his people around the prowling abominations. After about an hour of tense but uneventful driving, they left the site of the destroyed city behind. The scene of devastation was now obscured by the slopes and peaks, but the plume of smoke rising from the crater of Mount Erebus and the angry orange glow of the burning stronghold could still be seen. The crow guided the convoy to a wide crossroad and then dove down, landing near a small structure standing at the side of it. The convoy came to a halt, the civilian transports looking like they might not ever be able to get their engines running again. Sparing them an uneasy glance, Sunny jumped down from the roof of the Rhino and approached the structure. It seemed freshly built and was most likely constructed by the First Army just a month or two ago. He had no idea what its purpose was, though. Uncertain. Sunny glanced at the black bird, who looked very proud of itself. "What am I supposed to do with that?" The crow tilted its head. "Door open." "Oh, Despite its small size, the structure had actual blast doors blocking its entrance. The gate was large enough to be rammed by the rhino, but of course, Sonny was not going to order Luster to do something that stupid. He briefly thought about cutting through the blast doors with the cruel sight, but then shook his head with a roll of eyes, walked over to a small panel at the side of the gate, and placed his palm on it. The panel lit up, and then a mechanical voice came from the inbuilt dynamics. Captain Sunless. Verified. Sufficient clearance. The blast doors opened, revealing the entrance to a wide tunnel. Oh, hell no. Sonny remained motionless for a while, cursing his fate, then reluctantly sent one of his shadows into the tunnel. Despite his newly established aversion to tunnels of all kinds, that one turned out to be rather short, leading to a vast underground chamber. It was rectangular in shape, and large enough for the several convoys the size of the one Sonny was leading to take shelter inside. It's a hidden supply depot, a big one, at Thu, huh? Sonny's eyes widened. Inside the underground garage, rows and rows of pristine military vehicles stood, ready to be powered up and armed with full complements of heavy assault weapons. Chapter 963, Supply Depot. Sonny remained motionless for a while, until eventually there was a sound of footsteps approaching him. Turning around, he looked at Sergeant Gear with a blank expression. The soldier tensed, habitually expecting dreadful news. What? What's in there? Sonny lingered for a bit, then simply shook his head. Order the convoy to drive inside. You'll see soon enough. Before too long, the column of battered vehicles drove past him, disappearing into the dark tunnel. Once they were all inside, Sonny glanced at the falling ash one last time, then walked into the darkness himself. The blast doors closed behind him with a reverberating hum, cutting off the bitter cold and the chilling wind of the polar night. Just before the two plates of armored alloy touched, Master Jet's crow flew between them and landed on Sonny's shoulder. The bird glanced into the tunnel with curiosity, then stared at him and cawed a couple of times. For a change, those were simple caws and not mangled words of the human language. A pale smile appeared on Sonny's face. Yeah, good job. With that, he walked down the tunnel, soon reaching the underground garage. The convoy was parked in the empty corner of the vast chamber, and excited soldiers were already moving around the pristine military vehicles, evaluating their state. Someone else was busy opening alloy crates that were stacked along one of the walls, full of all kinds of supplies. The depot was brightly illuminated by powerful light fixtures, which had come online as soon as Sonny opened the gate using his command authority. The ventilation systems were also online, filling the underground space with a familiar, calming smell of artificially cleaned air. Sonny breathed in deeply and waited for Sergeant Gear to approach him. So, how is it? The soldier smiled, which made Sonny realize that he had never seen the dependable sergeant do that before. It's nothing short of amazing, sir. This is a divisional field resupply station, from what I can tell. It's meant to replenish the expended resources of an entire division between battles, if there's no convenient opportunity to reach a fortified stronghold or if the supply lines are cut. There's enough here to support the deployment of thousands of soldiers. He paused for a moment, and then pointed at the rows of vehicles. We have not assessed the full inventory yet, but you can already see that this is far more than we need. There are different types of machines, too, from armored personnel carriers to assault vehicles and light scouts. Hell, there's even a dozen MWPs here, with enough ammunition to load all their armaments. Sonny glanced at the towering shapes of the mobile war platforms standing near the back wall. These giant humanoid robots were about 6 meters tall, on the smaller side compared to their larger cousins, but they still packed a heavy punch. Samara's powerful rifle had been meant to serve as a light weapon for one of these formidable machines, but was later refitted to be used by the awakened sharpshooter. The presence of MWPs was a pleasant surprise. Mundane soldiers were somewhat capable of facing dormant nightmare creatures, but had troubles dealing with the awakened ones, even with the help of exoskeleton armor suits. The fierce arsenal of guns and launchers installed on the war platforms, however, made them destructive enough to accomplish that task. There was just one problem. Sonny gave Sergeant Gear a dubious look. Do we even have anyone capable of piloting these things? The soldier coughed and awkwardly scratched the back of his head. Oh no, not really. He remained silent for a few moments, then smiled again. Still, there's also ammunition for our turrets, as well as food, medicine, spare fuel cells, necessities basically all that the refugees need. We can even arm them all, if that is what you want to do. Those vehicles that we can drive are much faster than the civilian transports too, have better armor, and can navigate more difficult terrain. Not to mention that there's more of them than we can possibly use, or everything really. The infrastructure between here and Falcon Scott is also much better developed, so I think both our speed and defensive capabilities are going to increase tremendously. Sonny nodded, then glanced briefly at the crow who had left his shoulder and was now perching on one of the beams of the support framework near the ceiling of the depot, looking down at the hustling humans with a curious expression. Good. We'll be staying here for a couple of days, to let the people rest and give us time to get acquainted with all these shiny new toys. Make sure that everyone has a warm meal and a comfortable place to sleep. With that, he left gear to figure out the logistics of settling in hundreds of refugees in an underground storage bunker that was not really meant to be used for such a purpose, and tiredly walked toward the Rhino. There were many robust vehicles in the supply depot, but he did not see anything that could compare to his personal ride. The fearsome APC was still the best there was. I need some rest myself. Climbing inside the Rhino, he exchanged a few words with Professor Obel, then told Luster to figure out the sleep schedule between the irregulars and bring him some news from the Dream Realm by the morning, or whatever it was going to be once he woke up. Then, Sonny took off his military coat and dismissed the mantle of the underworld, which had been hidden beneath. At that moment, Beth was approaching him to say something, but lingered after noticing the dried blood and sealing patches glued to his skin. She paled a little, remained silent for a few moments, and then forced out an unconvincingly sarcastic remark. So you do bleed after all. Sonny looked down at his battered body and smiled. Only on special occasions. With that, he turned away, climbed into a sleeping niche, and closed his eyes in utter exhaustion. That was a long, dreadful, utterly terrible day. It did end on a positive note, though. That, at least, was something to be thankful about. Chapter 964, Proof of Competence. Shockingly, nothing disastrous happened while Sonny slept. A gate did not open in the middle of the supply depot, and a stray titan did not break through the blast doors to devour every last person under his protection. Somehow, the world did not collapse. Instead, Sonny woke up to the sounds of peaceful conversation and the smell of cooking food. He remained still for a few minutes, then climbed out of the sleeping niche, checked on his healing wounds, and summoned the puppeteer's shroud to cover his bruised body. In the lounge area of the Rhino, several members of his cohort were eating a hearty breakfast. Surprisingly, Professor Obel was the one cooking, masterfully using rations scavenged from the depot supplies to create something that smelled unexpectedly tasty. Walking closer, Sonny heard Luster speaking with surprising enthusiasm. Amazing. How did you even make this? The old man chuckled. Food was much more scarce during my youth than it is now. Ancient relics like me all know how to make a feast out of nothing, young man. Noticing Sonny, Luster pointed to his plate. Captain, you have to try it. He stuffed his mouth with something that looked like vegetable lasagna, which was rather strange, considering that military rations did not include fresh vegetables, and smiled. Oh, and we are also flush with water again. Shower is back online. That was a piece of surprisingly good news. The Rhino had a very robust water filtration system, but they had to start rationing it many days ago. The thought of an actual hot shower made Sonny smile. He sat down and curiously tasted Professor Obel's cooking. It was, indeed, rather delicious. Noticing his reaction, the old man chuckled. Everything pot slop. That's what we used to call this Frankenstein of a dish, back in my days. Times may change, but some things always remain the same. Sonny stared at his plate and then frowned. What's a Frankenstein? Professor Obel gave him an amused look. Well, it is a fictional monster. A sort of jigsaw corpse reanimated by a troubled scientist. Actually, perhaps it was the scientist who was the monster. Sonny gave him an understanding nod. Ah, I see a jigsaw corpse. I think I fought one of those before, although it was more of a mountain of bones. I guess you could make bone broth out of that. The professor is really being too harsh on himself. His cooking does not taste like corpse meat at all. I should know. Ignoring the strange glance directed at him, Sonny shrugged and concentrated on his food. The first shift of the irregulars sent into the dream realm was not back yet, so there was nothing pressing for him to do. Sonny finished his meal in peace, then chatted with his men for a bit. One after another, they left to resume their work on preparing the convoy for eventual departure. Beth was probably dealing with the refugees, so she was nowhere to be seen. That left Sonny and Professor Obel alone with each other. The old man studied his face for a few moments and then suddenly asked, "How are you holding up, Captain Sunless?" Sonny looked at him in confusion. "Me? Fine, I guess." Professor Obel sighed. "It must be hard, especially for someone so young. In this dire situation, you are responsible for the well-being of hundreds of people, but there is no one caring for your own wellness. So, that was why I asked. How are you, really?" Sonny wanted to retort, but then thought for a while and shrugged. "Actually, it's a bit strange. Everyone here is fighting tooth and nail to survive. Most of them have no control over whether they live or die. Every minute might be their last, and they all know it too. But not me. I am more or less safe. Unless I actively try to do something stupid, I will most likely survive even if the whole convoy is obliterated. My aspect makes it really easy for me to escape most dangers, you know." He hesitated, and then added with some uncertainty, "So the mental strain that I experience should be far less than that of all these vulnerable people. But for some reason it does not feel that way. I should not really care how many strangers die around me, but I do. It's like a mental hex, really. Me caring, actually. It's exactly like that. Especially because I do find myself doing stupid things to prevent them from dying." Sonny frowned. "Wait. I'm not really under a hex that compels me to defend this damned convoy, am I?" Professor Obel suddenly laughed. "A mental hex, that is a very unique way to put it. Isn't it normal for people to care about each other?" Sonny blinked a couple of times. "No, of course not." He shook his head, then added with slight bewilderment, "No one ever cared about me until I became powerful and thus useful. That's just how things work." Sonny had been alone for most of his life. True, after becoming infected by the spell, he had made several good friends, but he had no illusions about the reason for the bond between them. If he had been someone weak and useless, people like Effie, Kai, even Nephis and Cassie would have never wasted time on becoming close with him. And why should they? Well, there was Rain too, but that was different. She was family, not a random stranger. Professor Obel let out a sad sigh and remained silent for a while. Eventually he asked, "So why do you think you care about whether the refugees and the mundane soldiers survive? Why are you risking yourself to help them?" Sonny scratched the back of his head. "That I am actually not too sure myself. Maybe it's pride. These people are under my protection, so their deaths would demonstrate my incompetence. Makes sense. It is weird, though. I never really claimed to have something as useless as pride." The old man looked at him with a strange expression, then shook his head. "Do you want to know what I think?" Sonny raised an eyebrow. "Yes?" Professor Obel smiled. "I think that you are giving yourself too little credit, young man." Sonny stared at him in confusion. "Huh? What is that supposed to mean?" The old man chuckled. Don't mind me. It's just an old man's rumblings. Maybe you'll understand when you're my age. Until then, please keep caring for these poor people, stupid as it might seem. There's this one truth that I've learned after long decades, you see. Humanity would have never survived without a bit of stupidity. Chapter 965, New Plan. The news Sonny's people brought from the dream realm was both disturbing and ominous. There was a wealth of updates on the state of affairs in Antarctica, but all of it was overshadowed by one simple fact. Army Command was seemingly unaware that Erebus Field had been wiped off the map. They knew that something had happened, but it was the members of his cohort who brought the first-hand account of the devastation to the dream realm, prompting an intense reaction. That did not bode well for Sonny. Either the siege capital had been destroyed very recently, or the First Army was in much worse shape than he had thought. In any case, the situation meant that the validity of all information received from Army Command had to be taken with a grain of salt from now on. Things were changing too fast for their compromised communication network to keep up. It was just as well. He had already decided to proceed to Falcon Scott, bypassing the less impregnable siege capitals. It was going to be their eventual destination. Regardless, that much was clear. It seemed that the situation in East Antarctica was not as dire as the utter disaster of the Antarctic Center, which had much fewer soldiers and less resources allocated to it due to the smaller territory and population, but was being hit by the chain of nightmares much harder, for some reason. As a result, the previous plan was scrapped and hastily replaced with a new one. The incoming naval convoys were going to be redirected to start ferrying the civilian population and the army contingent over the strait to the larger and better protected eastern landmass. Falcon Scott would become the staging ground for the relocation, as well as humanity's last stronghold in the region. The First Army was abandoning the Antarctic Center entirely. So, there was no point in seeking shelter in any other siege capital, even if some of them could still be holding out. All divisions were going to retreat to Falcon Scott eventually anyway, taking the civilians with them. Sonny sighed. Sounds like a plan. A plan that could very well end in disaster, but a solid one, nevertheless. Army Command was not entirely clueless. Master Jet had to have known about Erebus Field to send her crow after him, after all, so it was not like the entire leadership was compromised. It was just that there were gaps in the flow of information between the headquarters and the people on the front lines, which was detrimental, but inevitable for as long as the Winter Beast still lived. As much as it pained Sonny to admit it, everyone was doing their best in a terrible situation. There was no one to blame. It was just that he personally had the misfortune of finding himself on the more dreadful end of the terribleness spectrum as far as circumstances were concerned. Damn it. Shaking his head, he climbed on the roof of the Rhino and silently observed the flurry of activity inside the resupply station. Everyone was busy. Even the refugees were helping load cargo into the vehicles Sergeant Gear had chosen to commandeer. The crow flew off its perch under the ceiling and landed near him, snuggling close to stare at the humans together. Sonny glanced at the blackbird incredulously. "What do you think? Will we make it?" The small monster glanced at him in confusion and cawed a couple of times. Sonny scoffed. "Figures, you're just an echo." "Oh, what do I call you anyway?" The bird tilted its head. "Crow, Crow." Sonny smiled. "Your name is Crow Crow? Huh. Well, I'll just call you Crow if you don't mind." The bird stared at him for a few moments, then cawed and flew away. Shaking his head, Sonny shifted his perception and concentrated on the view of the outside. One of his shadows remained there to watch the approach to the depot, hiding in the darkness. The ash was still falling from the sky, obscuring the stars and the crimson flames of the aurora. Black soot was marring the white surface of the snow, turning it into a dirty gray sludge. The silhouettes of the nearby mountains were outlined by the red glow that emanated from the sea of lava, making the whole landscape seem eerie and infernal. "This entire continent is way too weird. It's like I never left the dream realm." As Sonny thought that, a slight movement attracted his attention. Soon, a flicker of light appeared in the distance, and then a whole river of them showed itself from behind the cold slopes. The stream of light flowed down the mountain road, heading straight for the entrance to the supply depot. His face fell. Ah, not again. Out there in the ashen wilderness, a large column of battered vehicles was rolling down the road, escorted by scores of disheveled soldiers. Some were on foot, some moved with the help of powered exoskeleton armor suits, aiming into the darkness with their high-caliber rifles. The haunted expressions, the lightless eyes, the faces of frightened refugees behind the cracked windows of makeshift transports. All of it was too familiar. Sonny closed his eyes for a moment. Those would be the survivors of Erebus Field, then. With an exasperated sigh, he shook his head and then jumped off the roof of the Rhino. Outside the underground depot, a long column of vehicles had come to a halt. The soldiers were running to assume defensive positions, and their leaders were barking orders to get them moving faster. In front of the locked blast doors, several people stood with tired expressions on their faces. One of them, an awakened woman in a tattered robe, was cursing as she placed her hand on the security panel over and over again. The mechanical voice was not amused. Lieutenant Karen, verified. Insufficient clearance. Access denied. God damn it. The woman slammed her fist into the panel, then glanced at one of the other officers near her. After a few seconds of somber silence, she asked, "Do you think one of you guys can hack it? Or are we going to have to blow through this damned gate?" The man hesitated for a while, then opened his mouth to say something. Before he could, however, there was a reverberating hum, and the blast doors suddenly slid to the sides, revealing the entrance of a dark tunnel, and a very pale, very ominous-looking young man in black garments standing there with a strange, eerily calm expression on his face. "I would appreciate it if you don't try to blow up my gate, actually." The awakened woman jumped back with a yelp and outstretched one hand to summon a weapon. What the hell are you?" The pale stranger tilted his head a little and stared at her with his cold, dark eyes. "Master Sunless, First Irregular Company." With that, he looked past the officers at the long column of vehicles behind them. Suddenly, the young man's face grew a little lively. The awakened woman let out a relieved sigh. "Oh, you're human. Wait, master?" Glancing back at her, the young man suddenly smiled. "Say, you wouldn't happen to have a few MWP pilots in that convoy of yours, would you?" Chapter 966 Reinforcements. The new arrivals did indeed turn out to be one of the splinter groups of the Erebus field survivors. There were many more people in their caravan than in Sonny's caravan, but none of the soldiers held a higher military rank than him, the most senior officer among them being an awakened lieutenant named Karen. Needless to say, there were no masters among them either. So, ironically, he ended up being in charge again. Sonny had been responsible for 6 awakened and 2 civilians after leaving Low 49, which suited him fine. Then, more than 300 refugees and several dozens of mundane soldiers joined them. Those numbers seemed like a joke now. After the Erebus field survivors joined his group, Sonny found himself in command of a significantly larger force. There were more than 4,000 civilians currently sheltered in the crowded resupply station, as well as 500 mundane soldiers. Lieutenant Karen had many awakened warriors with her, as well as 4 new sleepers. Sonny sent the latter to their nameless counterpart, placing the young man in charge. The guy had turned out to be quite resourceful, and Bell's mentorship seemed to be bearing fruit, not to mention that his core was close to being saturated already. In the end, there were now 3 full awakened cohorts and a half under Sonny's command. There were also 12 powerful MWPs being piloted by mundane specialists and more than enough powered armor suits for the soldiers, which drastically increased the caravan's defensive ability. The vast supply reserves of the underground station suddenly did not look so inexhaustible anymore. This is going to be a headache. Studying the crowded depot, Sonny grimaced. The increase in power and in the number of tools at his disposal was welcome, but he would have to rethink his entire strategy as to how to traverse the 2,000 kilometers separating them from Falcon Scott. Before, Sonny had mostly put his efforts into avoiding combat engagements, meticulously circumventing nightmare creatures and only attacking those swarms that could not be bypassed. But with a caravan this large, that was not an option anymore. There was just no way to perfectly hide so many people. Luckily, the caliber of threats they could take on also increased. With several cohorts of awakened and a small army under his command, Sonny would be able to simply roll over many swarms, maybe even cut a path through the weaker hordes of abominations. But all of that required a lot of mental adjustment, and even more work for his shadows. His map would also have to be updated to account for the changes in the caravan's composition. Oh well, no sleep for me today, it seems. Walking toward the rhino with a slightly exasperated expression, Sonny couldn't help but hear bits and pieces of the conversations the new arrivals were having with the members of the initial convoy. "I don't think any of us can survive." "What's that? Cheer up, man. The devil himself is with us. So who can be against us?" "Oh, so it's that Master Sunless. No wonder the name sounded familiar. I heard about him, even though he was assigned to a different division. Still, what can one man do?" "Damn. What can't he do? I swear to the dead gods I saw him kill 100 nightmare creatures with a single arrow once. There was also this one time when he summoned a whole damn bridge out of thin air for us to cross a canyon. Hell, the man fought a titan to a stalemate just yesterday, actually. I'm not even sure that it was a stalemate. All I know is that the captain came back, but the titan did not. A corner of Sonny's mouth twisted up a little. His people were surely fond of embellishing his deeds, but he was not going to intervene. At this point, anything that raised morale of the troops was a good thing, even if it was not entirely based in truth. He climbed into the rhino and walked to the command suite, studying the new faces among the usual participants of strategic meetings. Sonny already knew awakened Karen, but the two mundane officers she brought for debriefing were strangers. Let's start. What he wanted to know first was how Erebus Field had fallen. The truth turned out to be as disturbing as Sonny had thought. As he had suspected, the city had been destroyed very recently. In fact, it had just happened 2 days ago, around the time he and his people were deciding to try their luck by charging the coastal highway. The main culprit of the disaster was also familiar. It was none other than his good friend Goliath. Damned bastard. After missing for the better half of 2 months, the stone giant had suddenly emerged from within Mount Erebus, breaking through one of its slopes and causing a whole side of the volcano to collapse. The resulting conflagration and the flood of lava had little chance of destroying a city that had been well fortified against exactly such an event, even if on a smaller scale. However, that was before the towering colossus smashed through the city defenses, destroying the grandiose magma barriers, drain vents, and most other contingencies the government had put in place. With the perimeter of the siege capital breached, a titan rampaging on its periphery, rivers of lava flowing through the broken barriers, and hordes of nightmare creatures using the chance to get inside, there had been nothing that the 1st Army Division stationed at Erebus Field could do to stop the cataclysmic assault. The few masters of the accompanying awakened force had joined forces to stall Goliath for as long as they could while the soldiers desperately tried to evacuate the civilians. That was probably where Davis and his cohort of irregulars had perished. Lieutenant Karen did not know how many people had made it out of that hell in the end, but judging by her expression, it was probably much less than the total population of the city. The last thing she had witnessed before leading the caravan away was the colossal figure of Goliath, turned incandescent from bathing in the molten lava, plunging into the ocean, and disappearing under the dark waves. From where the Titan had emerged the next day to attack Sonny's convoy. After Karen was finished speaking, a somber silence settled inside the rhino. No one knew what exactly to say. Eventually, Sonny sighed. Their nightmare is over. Chapter 967, Smooth Ride. 2 days later, they abandoned the resupply station. The underground depot was left almost empty, since Sonny had decided to take everything they could on the road. Not all the vehicles were loaded to capacity, but even if there was just a driver and a shooter inside, every last one was commandeered and put to good use. Only the discarded civilian transports, and those of the Erebus Field vehicles that were too damaged to remain reliable, were left behind. Nightmare, Abomination, and Blackie moved at the front of the caravan, serving as its vanguard. The Rhino was still at the head, but it was now flanked by 2 lumbering MWPs, both of them constantly scanning the surroundings with their high-tech optical arrays. Behind them, the long column of vehicles stretched for more than a kilometer on the mountain road. The remaining 10 MWPs and 24 Awakened were spread along its length, meant to protect the caravan in case of an attack from the flanks. Most of the vehicles were armed, and there were personnel carriers with full companies of mechanized infantry placed strategically among the refugee transports. All in all, the caravan looked like a big, delicious target for nightmare creatures, but also one that would be extremely hard to swallow. I'd like to see the bastards try, actually scratch that. I'd rather not. Sonny was positioned on the roof of the Rhino, wearing his military coat over the mantle of the underworld. With the elemental resistance of the onyx armor and the memory of ice slotted into it, he was more or less immune to mundane cold, so the chilling nature of the polar night was not bothering him too much. The falling ash, though, was still irritating. Hopefully they would leave the area near Mount Erebus soon. The wind was blowing in the other direction, which not only moved the clouds of ash away from the caravan, but would also make it harder for those nightmare creatures that relied on their sense of smell to detect the approaching humans far in advance. Still, He had no illusions that theirs would be a smooth ride. Luckily, Sonny was extremely well suited to serve as a guide. He had updated his map with as many details as he could and planned multiple suitable routes for the caravan. With his shadows scouting ahead and the crow keeping an eye out for hidden threats from high above, he was as informed about the surrounding area and the enemy movements as anyone could be. The shadows scouted most enemies long before the long column of vehicles approached, and the black bird with its magical eyes was able to notice anything that they missed. The combination was extremely effective. Information was the lifeblood of warfare, so Sonny had a considerable advantage. He was going to use it well to navigate the treacherous expanse of the Antarctic Center and reach Falcon Scott unscathed. His task had grown much harder because of the sheer size of the caravan, but on the other hand, the land they were traversing was also different from the complicated network of decrepit old roads in the south. The infrastructure between Erebus Field and the northern parts of the landmass had indeed been much more developed and then expanded on by the First Army in the recent months to boot. Plus, they were moving away from the area that had been affected by the earthquake the most, so there were fewer signs of destruction and obstacles on their path the further north the caravan drove. The roads were wider and better preserved. The terrain was less rugged. It was not as flat and straight as the coastal highway, of course. But Sonny felt reluctant to return to the ocean just yet. Even if he did, it would only be to bypass an especially difficult region and then swiftly return to the mountains. Or not at all. At first, there were not too many nightmare creatures in the way. Most of them that had been in the immediate area probably migrated to the ruins of Erebus Field and were yet to return. What little resistance the caravan did meet was promptly obliterated by the irregulars and Karens awakened. For the first day or so, the MWPs did not even have to fire a single shot. The next one brought more enemies with it, however. The caravan did not stop, with drivers working in shifts to keep it moving, so the destroyed city was now far behind them. Here, the abominations ran free, and plenty of them caught the scent of the large group of refugees. Swarm after swarm assaulted the column of vehicles, shattering against its defenses. The devastating barrage of bullets tore them apart, accompanied by arrows and magical projectiles tossed by the awakened. The MWPs let their monstrous Gatling guns and heavy mass drivers cut large swaths through the mass of abominations, sending swarms of explosive missiles flying from the mounted launchers from time to time. If the nightmare creatures got too close, destructive flamethrowers and awakened fighters made short work of them. If there were fallen or corrupted abominations among the swarms, Sonny and Nightmare charged forward before the creatures could do any harm to the refugees. With Sergeant Gear running logistics and organizing the mundane soldiers, Lieutenant Karen commanding most of the awakened, and Beth caring for the needs of the civilians, that was pretty much all he had to do. Dealing with the various powers nightmare creatures possessed was a bit challenging, but mostly, Sonny found himself unexpectedly free, which was good, since he had plenty of time to address his tasks as the strategist and guide of the caravan, but still. Weird. Am I actually a little bored? Looking at the remains of another swarm that the column had all but rolled over, Sonny scratched the back of his head. He knew, of course, that this rate of progress would not continue indefinitely. In fact, they were bound to get bloodied as soon as he failed to lead the caravan past a real horde of nightmare creatures, which was getting harder and harder to do. That had not happened yet, though. Am I suddenly very lucky, or has my luck just been really terrible up until now? Sonny pondered about it for a few moments, and decided that it was probably both. The question was, how long would the stretch of good fortune last? Chapter 968, Shifting Scales. A few more days passed in the clamor of firing armaments and frenzied howls of dying nightmare creatures. The dark landscape of the Antarctic Center flowed past the incessantly moving caravan, with the starlight and the undulating visage of Aurora Australis finally appearing from behind the clouds of ash, only to be devoured by the veil of snow. The blizzard was picking up again, making Sonny wonder if he was going to meet the second Titan raging in the region. He was not very enthused to make its acquaintance, to say the least. The journey was a strange one. Sonny was used to things going south fast, but the situation of the caravan was very different. Instead of something dreadful and devastating happening all at once, their circumstances were growing slightly more dire with every hour, bringing them closer to annihilation, little by little. The confident pace the caravan had established after leaving the resupply station was long gone. Instead of rare skirmishes with weak swarms of nightmare creatures, they were now embroiled in a nearly unstoppable battle with the sea abominations flooding the northern reaches of the Antarctic center. The pressure on the Awakened and the MWP pilots had increased tremendously, and the infantrymen had to bloody their bayonets on more than one occasion already. Worst of all was the inescapable corrosion that the multitude of gates were exerting on their tech. The military vehicles were shielded from the detrimental effects of the call to some degree, but very few had the same rare and expensive modifications as the Rhino had. They were managing for now, but there was no telling how long it would last. The problems were mounting. The casualties were mounting too. During the harrowing push to Erebus Field, Sonny had lost only a handful of people to the vagaries of the spell and the deadly crucible of battle. Their losses were few enough to consider each one a poignant event. It was not so much for the current step of the journey. The caravan had grown too much, and the combat engagements they had to fight were too frequent and intensive to avoid losing soldiers. The attrition rate was not terrible, and in fact remained admirably low, but it seemed that every time Gear contacted him to give an update on the state of the column, more names had to be added to the list. Sonny was strangely bothered by it. He had thought that with the drastic increase in numbers, the loss of individual soldiers would not affect him too much, especially if the casualties were below expected. He had also thought that he would eventually grow numb to the news of people under his command dying. But he had not. The more of his soldiers died, no matter how few, the more bitter and angry he felt. However, the most powerful emotion he experienced was rather unexpected. Indignation. Sonny felt indignant about the fact that he was forced to watch good men and women die, to see mundane humans putting their lives on the line to protect the defenseless refugees, all the while the truly powerful ones were nowhere to be seen, embroiled into their own internal strife. Damned bastards. Maybe he wasn't cut out to be a leader after all. That was not to say that Sonny was ineffective. On the contrary, he was doing a good job of leading the caravan and pretending to be an intrepid commander. However, it was all alien to him. It was something he was doing because the circumstances had forced him to, not because he wished to play that role. Living alone in the dark had been much more comfortable. Ah, good old times. There was another strange thing about the caravan's advance north, something that Sonny should have expected, but nevertheless failed to account for. Despite the slow attrition, the number of people under his command was not reducing. Instead, it was growing, ballooning even. The further they drove, the larger the caravan became. There were other large groups of people who had escaped from Erebus Field, squads of soldiers that had lost contact with Army Command due to the blizzard, and evacuation convoys that had gotten stuck in a limbo after their destination was destroyed. All of them were happy to see a well-organized force moving north, especially since it was led by a master. So, they joined the caravan. Sonny could not really turn the stragglers away, and at that point, there was no point to. So, the 4,000 refugees under his protection turned to 5, then 6, and then 12. The 500 soldiers turned into more than 1,000. The 3 cohorts of Awakened swelled to 7, and there were now 2 auxiliary sleeper cohorts instead of 1. There were many more vehicles, too. The bloated caravan stretched for 2 kilometers now and showed no signs of stopping the rapid expansion. Looking at it, Sonny couldn't help but shake his head. That's just a recipe for disaster. At this rate, he was going to end up leading a whole division by the time they reached Falcon Scott, if they reached it. Hopefully, he would stumble on a colonel or 2 and push the command responsibility on them soon. If the colonel was not an idiot, of course. Sonny had just finished dealing with a very nasty fallen demon laying in ambush in the path of the caravan and returned to the head of the column. As soon as he appeared from the shadows on the roof of the Rhino, the crow flew down and perched on his shoulder, his feathers ruffled and covered with snowflakes. He glanced at the miserable bird and sighed. What? Did you see something? The small monster bobbed its head. Crow saw. Sonny waited for the crow to continue, knowing that it had to be bad for the echo to seek him out. The flying monster cawed again. Horde, horde. With that, the bird turned its head and pointed its beak in a certain direction. Curse it. There was a horde of nightmare creatures ahead, one that the crow did not know how to avoid. Finally, Sunny's fears had come true. He hurriedly sent the shadow that was closest to the direction where the echo was pointing to forward. It had already been scouting far ahead, but apparently not far enough. Soon, Sunny's eyes narrowed. There was indeed a vast horde of abominations, and bypassing it was out of the question. Well, unless he used the coastal highway, of course. In that case, the caravan would have a chance of skirting the sea of abominations unmolested. A slim chance at that. They would also be risking a meeting with something even worse. Damnation, Chapter 969, Gifts of the Shore. Sunny's shadow swiftly glided through the darkness, climbing the steep slopes above the vast river of nightmare creatures. Sunny was trying to gauge the true size of the horde, but no matter how hard he looked, there was simply no end to it. All kinds of abominations were gathered in a tremendous mob, which spilled over the cliffs, undulating and crawling over the landscape. The horde was stretched into a long line, moving from east to west toward the coast. The width of it was somewhat bearable, making the thought of trying to cut through the mass of nightmare creatures appear tentatively in his mind. However, the length of the horde was simply too oppressive. The caravan was very large now, and even if Sunny managed to create a breach in the river of monsters, not all vehicles would be able to pass through before a tide of abominations ripped them apart. It was still an option, though. He had to think strategically. To the east, the horde stretched for as far as his shadow could see. To the west, there was still some space between the front ranks of the mob of nightmare creatures and the coastal highway. If the column of vehicles sped up while the abominations maintained their pace, there was a good chance that they would narrowly miss each other. If not, the caravan would be caught between the horde and the ocean, potentially suffering even more casualties. That was not even considering that something could attack them from the water, as well. Sunny sighed. Crap. The first option all but guaranteed that people would die, but had a lower damage ceiling. The second promised a small chance that no one would be killed at all, but had the potential to turn really disastrous if things went wrong. He hesitated for a few moments, then contacted Gear. Yes, Captain. Sunny gritted his teeth. There's a horde of nightmare creatures ahead. Full forward, and we will be taking a detour via the highway. Inform everyone to prepare for a tough battle. There. The decision had been made. Sunny was not happy with it, but at least the caravan stood a chance of escaping unscathed. He was not ready to callously send people to die yet, even if it meant risking a more dire result. At the end of it, Sunny would know that he at least tried. Following his orders, Luster sent the Rhino flying forward. Their MWP escorts strained to keep up, but eventually adjusted to the increased pace. The military vehicles comprising the caravan followed suit, and soon, the whole column was moving forward at a reckless speed. Do not brake. Sunny stared back, hoping that nothing would go wrong. If a vehicle broke down in the middle of the charge, there would be no saving its passengers. A faulty transport could also potentially slow down everyone behind it, which would be a complete disaster. However, the fewer number of gates along the coast was one of the reasons he had chosen the second option, so if anything, leaving the mountains for a bit should only lessen the probability of a serious malfunction. The Rhino maneuvered to a branching road and led the caravan west, descending toward the highway. As they approached it, Sunny tensely observed the horde and tried to calculate if they were going to make it past the advancing mob of abominations before it reached the coast. For now it seemed that there was still a narrow window of opportunity. But then, as soon as they reached the highway, that window was gone. For some reason, the front ranks of the horde suddenly went into a frenzy and rushed forward, with the rest of the mob soon following in an avalanche of flesh. Sunny was sure that the nightmare creatures could not have sensed the caravan yet, so he did not know why their behavior changed so abruptly. It was as though something on the coast was pulling the abominations toward it. In any case, with the horde moving much faster now, any chance of passing by without a battle the column might have had were gone. They would have to fight their way through, in the end. Curses. At least the caravan was only going to be assaulted from one side. Their left flank would be protected by the ocean, precarious as it might sound. What the hell spooked these bastards? Looking forward to see the first abomination spilling onto the highway some distance away, Sunny froze for a moment. Oh, Out there ahead of them, laying on the shore like a mountain of white flesh, the corpse of a colossal abomination towered above the highway. It looked like a monstrous jellyfish of mind-boggling proportions, some of its lifeless tentacles stretching for hundreds of meters into the dark water. The strange, transparent flesh of the dead dweller of the depths was torn and scorched, with large chunks of it missing. Strange organs could be seen beneath it, and a lake of freezing slime covered a long stretch of the highway around it. Something had thoroughly savaged the terrifying creature, and then left without devouring its prey. And now, the horde of nightmare creatures was rushing to finish the job. As Sunny watched, the tide of abominations flowed over the highway. The first ranks sunk their fangs into the dead horror with rabid hunger, followed by 100 other creatures the next second. The appalling corpse was giant, but not giant enough to satiate them all. Soon, the slower nightmare creatures reached the coast, ruthlessly tearing at the bodies of their feasting brethren to reach the succulent white flesh. They crawled over the towering jellyfish like ants, slowly eviscerating its upper layers. And behind them, countless more were already flowing down the mountain slopes. Sunny gripped his bow, knowing the caravan would have to fight their way through that dreadful barrier of monstrous bodies soon. Actually, a few stragglers were already close enough for Samara to start firing her rifle. Looking at the approaching scene of morbid carnage, Sunny felt a chill run down his spine. It's all right. We can still pull through this. That was what he thought, at least until eerie flashes of crimson light ignited in the haze of the blizzard to his left. Far in the ocean, an enormous, gargantuan shape was moving through the waves, getting closer to the shore. Chapter 970 Hellfire. As the caravan approached the spilling horde of nightmare creatures, Sunny readied himself for battle and feverishly tried to come up with a way, any way to save the lives of as many people as he could. However, no matter how much he thought about it, there was just no solution. Many souls were going to be lost today, and the best he could accomplish was to make sure that those who were dying were the soldiers, and not the refugees. He knew that the caravan would be able to break through the horde of abominations eventually, but he also knew that at least several vehicles, as well as scores of his soldiers, would perish in the process. Hundreds, if not thousands of humans were going to die today. His gamble did not pay off. Sunny felt a bit resentful about that. With a sigh, he summoned the helmet of the mantle of the underworld and raised Morgan's warbow. It was at that moment that eerie crimson lights flashed through the haze of the blizzard, followed by a scattering of small sparks. He froze and looked to his left, at the dark expanse of the ocean that was obscured by the veil of snow. Out there, something inconceivably gargantuan was hiding, its enormous shape only revealed by the hazy flashes of crimson light. What? In the next moment, a deafening roar assaulted his ears, and then, something that he had never expected happened. Ahead of the convoy, the mass of nightmare creatures were suddenly torn apart by a series of earth-shattering explosions. Bits of concrete, flesh, and bone flew into the air, creating a cloud of red fog. A moment later, flowers of angry red flame bloomed on the slope of the mountain, obliterating even more abominations. The whole world trembled. Sunny's eyes widened as he swiftly looked back at the ocean. The wall of the blizzard had been unmade as well, and although the breach in the snowstorm was already closing, he still managed to catch a glimpse of the source of all that carnage. The gargantuan shape drifting on the waves was a massive, battered battleship. He thought he even recognized the lines of its mangled alloy hull. The vessel was strangely slanted, one of its sides resting much lower than the other one, the deck railings almost touching the water. Its hull was marred by terrible scars and breached in many places, with some of the holes being large enough for the rhino to drive through, and was just what remained above the surface. The bow of the ship seemed shattered and deformed. It was a mystery how the vessel remained afloat. And yet it was still capable of firing its armaments. The crimson lights Sunny had seen were the batteries of starboard cannons unleashing hell, and the scattering of sparks was the salvo of missiles being launched from their nests. As Sunny watched, the ghostly battleship fired another barrage of heavy explosive rounds at the horde of nightmare creatures, this time aiming entirely at the slopes of the mountains. He blinked. I'll be damned. Did they really receive reinforcements? Sonny did not know where the wrecked vessel had come from, but he was not going to waste this opportunity. The intention of the unknown captain was clear. The first salvo somewhat cleared the highway, and the second one overshot it by a good degree, slamming into the mountain slope and obliterating a large swath of advancing nightmare creatures, cutting off those who still remained on the road from the rest of the horde, for now, while simultaneously opening a path for the caravan. That was his chance. Silently thanking the daredevil who had used the sinking ship to come to their rescue, Sonny drew his bow and sent the strike of thunder flying forward. A moment later, it hit the mountain of white flesh, electrocuting scores of abominations that had been fighting to devour the giant jellyfish just a few moments before. All forward units attack. The MWPs running beside the Rhino simultaneously raised their bulky hands and opened fire. Their accuracy while on the move was not too great, but that was not important when massive Gatling guns were involved. Streams of heavy rounds whipped across the surviving nightmare creatures, ripping many to shreds. A moment later, two swarms of missiles shot from the shoulders of the lumbering machines, adding to the chaos. From somewhere further behind, heavy-duty mass drivers joined the fray, with the turrets of the assault vehicles soon following. The front of the caravan had once again formed into a wedge to open lines of fire for more attackers. Only this time, there were many more vehicles, awakened, and war platforms shooting. The already thinned front rows of the mass of nightmare creatures covering the highway were all but erased from existence by their onslaught. A moment later, the Rhino plowed into the remaining stragglers, painting itself with red. Sonny sent several arrows flying, and then dismissed his bow, summoning the cruel sight instead. As soon as he saw the APC clear the stretch of the road obstructed by the horde, he stepped through the shadows and appeared in the thick of the enemies descending from the mountains. Even though most of them were being destroyed by the continuous barrage from the mangled battleship, many were still getting through. The cacophony of bestial howls, thunderous explosions, and roaring artillery strikes was shaking the world, but he did not let it distract him. Now that the head of the caravan had broken through the blockade, the battle was not over. On the contrary, it was just starting. They had to hold back the tide of monsters to let the whole column drive through the created corridor, and then stall the abominations to let it escape. Moving with practiced grace, he butchered a lunging monstrosity that resembled a wingless bat, and then crushed another creature's skull with the butt of his spear. The dying wish weaved itself into existence, summoning the ire of the frenzied horde upon him, but also inspiring his soldiers. One after another, the cohorts of the awakened joined Sonny in building a wall of sharp steel along the edge of the highway. The MWPs stood behind them, drowning the mountain slopes with hellfire unleashed by their flamethrowers. Several personnel carriers stopped, releasing companies of mechanized infantry, each soldier clad in an exoskeleton suit of powered armor and carrying a heavy rifle. In a matter of minutes, the safe corridor was secured. Now, all they had to do was hold the line and show the abominations what the First Army was really made of. Devil is with us. Show them hell. Burn in fire, you wretches. Sonny was rather surprised by the enthusiasm the soldiers who had just recently joined his caravan were showing. Well, he was not going to complain. Maybe it was the effect of the dying wish, or maybe they just wanted to avenge Erebus Field and wash off the shame of defeat off their souls. Thrusting the cruel sight into the open maw of a fallen abomination, he suddenly felt a strange jolt run through the mantle of the underworld. Suddenly, the onyx armor felt slightly lighter. What is that about? Shaking off the weird feeling, he jerked the corpse of the nightmare creature off his spear's blade and looked around, searching for another target. Chapter 971, Strategic Retreat. Sonny and his soldiers held back the abominations while the long column of vehicles drove through the cleared corridor. The pressure the horde was exerting on them was dire, but not impossible to overcome thanks to the artillery support from the mangled battleship. The awakened and the mundane soldiers worked together, aided by the lumbering MWPs and assault vehicles. Soon the whole mountain slope was torn apart and enveloped in flames. An angry red glow spread through the blizzard, making it seem as though the snow itself was aflame, and the sounds of firing armaments, detonating explosives, and bestial howls fused into an ugly, deafening litany. Sunny was busy dealing with the most threatening abominations, moving through the shadows to reach them in time. His swift figure appeared from and disappeared into the darkness, leaving a trail of death and devastation behind. Sometimes it almost seemed as though he was existing in several places simultaneously, which fueled the zeal of his soldiers. For now, the line of defenders was holding. And every minute they did, more vehicles drove past the monstrous corpse of the giant jellyfish to clear the battlefield. So far, so good. At some point, the cannons of the battleship grew quiet, and the rain of artillery shells stopped. Either the vessel had run out of ammunition, or the stress of sustaining the heavy barrage had turned out to be too much for its already failing hull, causing it to sustain even more damage. In any case, by that point, most of the caravan had managed to pass the advancing horde. With artillery bombardment gone and no killing field between them and the highway anymore, a flood of nightmare creatures rushed forward, aiming to slam into the defensive line of humans and rip them apart. That was when Sunny finally utilized shadow manifestation. He had not used it before in order to conserve essence for this exact moment, but now there was no point in holding back anything anymore. Rows of dark spikes rose from the ground, obstructing the advance of the abominations and forcing some to impale themselves on their sharp tips. Pushed from behind by the frenzied mob, more were run through, perishing right there and then. Others were simply slowed down. The spikes were soon destroyed. But their job was already done. The momentum of the horde was stalled, and the MWPs were able to create a wall of fire in its way. A few moments later, burning monsters burst through the flames, lunging at the defensive line with rabid rage. They were met by sharp steel and a rain of bullets. "Hold, we are not done yet." Following his command, the soldiers held. The awakened were burning through their essence, while the mundane fighters were exhausting their ammunition, but they held. 1 minute, then 2. Finally, the last of the vehicles drove past and disappeared into the haze of the snowstorm. Sunny let out a relieved sigh. The battle was not over yet, but at least the refugees were safe. Infantry, retreat. Pulling out of the furious engagement was not an easy task, and had to be done in stages. First, the mundane soldiers orderly retreated, loading into the personnel carriers. After the massive vehicles drove off, the weakened defensive line shifted, slowly moving back. As they did, the MWPs fired clusters of remote-controlled landmines, leaving hundreds of them in the wake of the retreating human force. Once enough of the pushing nightmare creatures entered the blast zone, the mines detonated, momentarily shaking the world. The defenders used that moment to abandon the battle. The awakened jumped onto the roofs of waiting vehicles, which then sped away. The MWPs followed, turning their torsos 180 degrees to continue firing back as they ran. Sunny was left alone to face the wrath of the bloodied horde. Well, not quite. Nightmare emerged from the shadows with fury and bloodlust burning in his crimson eyes. Looking at the approaching tide of abominations, Sunny smiled coldly. "Come at us, bastards!" The shadows surged around him, shooting forward like dark chains. At the same time, the cruel sight shined with incandescent light. He used the chains and walls of shadows to funnel the nightmare creatures, killing and maiming as many as he could with his spear. Nightmare rampaged in their midst, too swift to be caught and brought down, at least for now. But then again, they were not going to linger for long. All Sunny had to do was buy his soldiers time to put some distance between themselves and the enemy. Soon, all his defenses were obliterated, and it seemed like he and his shadow were going to be overwhelmed in mere moments. That was when both of them turned into incorporeal shadows and fled, leaving a sea of furious nightmare creatures behind. Now, the battle was truly finished. What was especially great about its conclusion, and a pleasant surprise to Sunny, was that while some abominations lunged in pursuit of the caravan, most remained seemingly more interested in the carcass of the monstrous jellyfish and the corpses of their own slain brethren. It seemed that the caravan had managed to escape. Thank the gods. A minute later, Sunny and Nightmare emerged from the shadows and flew over the highway, soon catching up to the retreating soldiers. The caravan was still out of sight, hidden behind the wall of snow, but they would rejoin the main column soon. In cases like these, the forward force was meant to slow down, so as not to leave itself without sufficient protection for too long. Sunny ordered his steed to get close to the rearmost vehicle and looked at Samara, who was unsurprisingly sitting on its roof. With her red hair dancing in the wind, she was aiming her rifle back, firing a shot into the blizzard from time to time. "How are you on essence?" Samara glanced at him briefly, then smiled. "Doing well, Captain." With a nod, he jumped up, placing his feet on the saddle, then leaped over to the roof of the vehicle and settled next to his sharpshooter. Sunny was confident in his riding skill, but not confident enough to try sitting on Nightmare backwards and shooting his bow. As Morgan's warbow started weaving itself from scarlet sparks, Sunny lingered for a moment, and then summoned the runes. That strange jolt I felt at the start of the battle. Don't tell me, did I finally fulfill the requirements of the mantle of the underworld? Chapter 972, Soulbound. Sunny zoned out for a little, not paying attention to Samara and the MWPs discharging their weapons from time to pick off the most stubborn of the pursuers. The rate of their fire was slowing down anyway, meaning that the bulk of abominations had either fallen behind or were already killed. The Prince of the Underworld enchantment and its dreadful counter of vanquished foes, gods. He had been stuck with that thing for so long. Despite the fact that Sunny had inherited the onyx armor with some of it already filled, it still took him years to accumulate 6,000 victories. Come to think of it, the whole mongrel debacle had happened because of his desire to increase the number on the counter somewhat. I can't believe I've finally done it. Curious to see what changed, Sunny looked at the runes. He was a bit tense after all. The description of the Prince of the Underworld only said that the armor would be growing stronger the more foes he vanquished. And it had, over the years. The cost of keeping its active enchantments running had diminished slightly, and their effects had become a little more pronounced. The description said nothing about the mantle receiving an upgrade after the counter was filled. That was just his assumption. Come on. Concentrating on the name of the memory, he read, Memory, Mantle of the Underworld. Memory rank, Ascended. Memory tier, 7. Oh, the mantle seemed to have grown from a tier 6 memory to a tier 7 one. That was not bad, but it did leave Sunny a little disappointed. He had hoped that it would increase in rank instead. He sighed, then continued to study the runes, turning his attention to the enchantments. The living stone, feather of truth, stalwart, and underworld armament enchantments remained exactly the same. None of them received any enhancements. The Prince of the Underworld had not changed either, except for the fact that the counter now showed a pleasant 6,000 as the number of vanquished foes. There was a new enchantment at the end of the list, though. Soulbound Relic. Sunny blinked a couple of times. Huh? Suddenly excited, he concentrated on the enchantment to read its description. The description, however, left him largely confused. It did not provide any information about what a soulbound relic was, or what powers that title entailed. Instead, the shimmering runes simply stated, bind the relic. He was probably supposed to answer yes or no. However, Sunny lingered. He had no idea what binding the mantle of the underworld to his soul meant, and how it would change the onyx armor or his soul for that matter. Of course, the effect was most likely meant to be beneficial, since it was a reward for achieving an amazing feat. The spell often had a very strange notion of what beneficial meant, though, which did not always coincide with what a human would consider such. Take his own aspect, for example, its innate ability. Shadow Bond had become the bane of his existence, and yet the spell clearly thought of it as a precious boon. Further still, the mantle of the underworld was not even the spell's creation. Rather, it was a memory of an artifact created by Nether, the demon of destiny, most likely for one of his stone children. Sunny suspected that it had once belonged to the stranger, one of the 7 heroes of the Forgotten Shore, who had been of Saint's tribe and possibly her previous lord. So what would actually happen if he bound that artifact to his soul? Huh? He hesitated for a while, then dismissed the runes. Not because he had decided against activating the new enchantment, but rather because his shadows had noticed something strange on the road ahead, the tail of the caravan. The caravan, for whatever reason, had stopped. Damn it. That was outside the scope of the action plan he had established. Luster was not supposed to stop the rhino unless something truly drastic happened. Sunny prepared himself for the worst, but then relaxed a little after discovering the reason for the unexpected turn of events. It was honestly hard to miss. Slightly ahead of the convoy, beached on the cold shore, the mangled battleship that had helped them break through the horde of nightmare creatures towered like a vast mountain of metal. Up close, the damage done to it looked even more dreadful. Its hull was full of holes, and most of its cargo holds seemed to be full of water. It was obvious that the proud vessel would never sail again. People were emerging from the breaches in the hull, looking like tiny ants as they loaded into lifeboats and headed for the shore. Some of them had already reached land, and were now talking to a small crowd of soldiers from the caravan. Sonny let out a relieved sigh, told Samara to establish a perimeter around the rear of the column, and jumped off the vehicle, turning into a shadow. Gliding to the front of the caravan did not take him long. Returning to his human form near the rhino, Sonny dismissed the helmet of the mantle and headed toward the welcoming party. I should really thank whoever was in charge of that battleship. They saved our skin back there. As he neared the small crowd, he heard a pleasant but strained voice asking a question. Your commanding officer, then? One of the soldiers responded, "Oh, that would be the devil. Captain." The representative of the ship interrupted him, sounding surprised and a little tense. "Your commanding officer is a devil?" The soldier grunted. "Not a devil, the devil. But don't worry, sir, it's just a nickname, I think." At that moment, Sonny finally reached them and saw the speaker. His eyes widened a little. Tall, handsome, with black hair and eyes of an unusual, beautiful indigo color. No wonder the voice sounded familiar. Knave? The night walker seemed a bit ragged and worse for wear, but it was unmistakably Master Knave of the House of Night, his temporary pal. Hearing Sonny's voice, Knave looked away from the soldier he had been talking with, then lowered his gaze a little and smiled in surprise. "Sunless? Wait, is it really you? How are you here?" Sonny coughed awkwardly, then glanced at the talkative soldier with murder in his eyes. "Ah, that's me, actually. I'm the devil in charge of delivering these fools from hell." Chapter 973, Mutual Rescue. Knave stared at him in bewilderment for a few moments, then glanced at the column of military vehicles that stretched far into the distance. "You are the commanding officer? Things must have changed then. Not that I'm complaining. It's actually great to see a familiar face. I just thought that you were supposed to be in charge of a single cohort of elite awakened." Sonny sighed. "Yeah, well, the situation is a mess, so I ended up being in charge of an entire battalion instead, as well as around 12,000 refugees. Anyway, thanks for the rescue. I really owe you one, Naive. That battle could have turned ugly without your ship's support." He studied the gargantuan shape of the beached vessel, finally recognizing it as the battleship that had delivered his cohort to Antarctica several months ago. Or what was left of it, rather. Knave let out an amused chuckle. "Ah, yes, the rescue, truth be told. It is us who need to be rescued. As you can see, the ship is not exactly in great shape, and the crew, the ones who are still alive, are not in any way prepared for a long land-bound march across Antarctica. We are only truly capable at sea, and even then." He glanced at the mangled remains of the fearsome vessel. "Ah, the sea turned out to be more capable than us, in the end. In any case, your caravan is pretty much our best hope. So do you maybe have space in these vehicles for a few thousand shipwrecked sailors, give or take?" Sonny stared at him for a few moments, then smiled. "Sure, no problem. That can be arranged. There's a lot of useful stuff left in those cargo holds, I assume. Come with me, and we can discuss the details. How the hell did your ship end up here, anyway? Wasn't the convoy supposed to be coursing between Falcon Scott and the Northern Quadrant?" As it turned out, Knave's vessel was one of those that, like Ariadne, had been reassigned to patrol and relocation duty after the situation in the Antarctic Center worsened with the appearance of hostile titans. His last orders were to scout and secure the stretch of the coastal highway between Erebus Field and the northern parts of the landmass, probably for the upcoming exodus of the First Army to Falcon Scott. Sadly, Erebus Field had been destroyed, and the battleship met an adversary that was a little bit too tough for it. In the end, they had managed to kill the monstrous jellyfish, whose corpse eventually washed up on the shore, but not before sustaining catastrophic damage. With no friendly port nearby, the vessel drifted along the coast for a while before encountering Sunny's caravan. Sunny spared Nave a grim look. I was actually supposed to be evacuated from the southernmost tip of the region by a vessel called Ariadne. It was destroyed too, leaving me stranded there. What was Army Command thinking, separating individual battleships from the convoy? Wasn't it obvious that it would be too dangerous for them to sail alone? The tall Nightwalker sighed somberly. Not as obvious as you might think. The coastal waters are not usually that dangerous when compared to the true deep sea. Or at least, they used to be safer. There were risks involved, of course, but that is a given when you are desperate. Still, we might have underestimated how much influence the chain of nightmares would exert on the ocean. Makes sense, I guess. Sunny was not surprised that Army Command had chosen to send the divisions spread across the Antarctic Center some naval support. Logistically, it was a risky but somewhat necessary decision, considering that the Winter Beast had shut down the entire communication network across the landmass. And it was not like Knives' battleship had been immediately sunk. The fearsome vessel operated along the coast for close to 2 months before stumbling on the abominable jellyfish and suffering a Pyrrhic victory that led to its demise. If anything, Sunny was more surprised that the House of Night had agreed to play ball. Since when were the great clans so altruistic? That's a conversation for later. For now, both Nave and Sunny had a lot to do. The structure of the caravan had to be reorganized to make room for the surviving sailors. The sailors themselves had to disembark and reach land. The maimed battleship had to be scoured for anything that could be useful for the long journey to Falcon Scott. All of that required time, which meant that the column would remain static for a while. A proper defensive perimeter had to be established, guard duty shifts had to be set, refugees needed to be fed and cared for. Sunny might have as well given an order to make camp, but he was extremely reluctant to remain on the coast for an entire night. So, all these things had to happen fast. Luckily, he was not the only master defending the caravan anymore. Even though most of Nave's powers seemed to have to do with water, he was still an ascended more than that. He was an ascended from a great clan. The Nightwalker was an absolute elite among fighters, with long years of battle experience under his belt and a vast arsenal of powerful memories stored in his soul. Having someone like that by his side made Sunny feel much more confident in their chances of reaching Falcon Scott in one piece. But coming back to a vast arsenal of memories, Sunny looked at Nave with a strange expression on his face. The handsome man noticed it and raised an eyebrow in confusion. Yes. Did you want something, Sunless? Sunny lingered for a few moments, then smiled. As a matter of fact, I do. Say, Nave. You Nightwalkers are all about naval combat, right? You wouldn't happen to have a memory or two that can help a land rat like me do well in water, would you? You know, things like breathing under it, swimming like a torpedo and so on, because if you do, I am willing to trade. No, actually, I am really willing to trade. I all but swore to never get close to water without a memory like that, you see. Nave blinked a couple of times. Well, actually, I do have something like that, yes. What do you want to trade for? Sunny hesitated, then pointed at a young man who just happened to walk by them at that moment. See that guy? His name is Luster. He's a very valuable awakened. A top-notch talent. Do you want me to trade him to you? The Nightwalker coughed. I am pretty sure that Army Command would not be happy if you sold me one of your subordinates, Sunless. Sunny remained silent for a moment, then sighed. That's true. A pity. Chapter 974, Shadow in the Shell. In the end, Sunny did make a trade with Nave. He had a surplus of memories after slaying many nightmare creatures to defend the convoy, and the Nightwalker was in dire need of weapons and armor suited for land combat, to arm his own awakened. There had been a full cohort of them aboard the battleship once, but now only 4 remained. Since these warriors of the House of Night would be defending the caravan along with the other awakened in the near future, and Saint was still slumbering, Sunny did not drive a hard bargain. That was how he received 2 new memories, which were meant to cover the gap in his arsenal when it came to traversing and fighting in the water. One of them was a simple awakened charm that allowed him to breathe underwater. It was called Essence Pearl, and had 2 enchantments. One passively produced air, the other had to be activated and gifted the wielder with the ability to see clearly, as if they were wearing a glass mask. The description of the charm simply stated that breathing was the essence of life, and beauty was its purpose. One had to be able to see clearly to appreciate beauty and live long enough to enjoy it. How romantic. The second memory was ascended and appeared to be an armor of sorts. In truth, it was more of a harness made out of a fisherman's net, which provided no protection whatsoever, but allowed the wearer to swim with surprising speed. The harness was called Nimble Catch, and its description told the story of a muskrat king who had sworn to eat a wondrous fish, only to learn that it could only be caught by using the eyes of the monarch of birds, his brother, as bait. The whole thing was very weird. What's a muskrat, though? Do rats eat fish? The only drawback of the strange harness was that, as usual, no other armor-type memory could be used while wearing it. Nevertheless, Sunny was happy with his acquisitions. The inability to defend himself in water had been eating at him ever since the sea journey to Antarctica, and even though he hoped to never have to use these new memories, simply possessing them was calming. Several hours after encountering the beached battleship, the caravan drove forward once again. The length of it remained the same, but there were many more people in the vehicles now. Nave had not been joking when he said that there were thousands of sailors on the mangled vessel. And even then, those were only those who had survived. Sunny honestly did not know whether to consider them soldiers or refugees, but he knew that Sergeant Gear and the other officers would sort that out for him soon. The caravan had a lot of spare weapons, especially now that they had unloaded the surviving cargo holds of the battleship, so there was a good chance that many of the sailors would become active combatants. Even if not, Sunny was already satisfied to have another master around. Nave's presence also did wonders for the morale of everyone in the caravan, not only because he was an ascended, but also because of how flamboyantly he had appeared. If there was a sure way to win someone's adoration, it was to shower a horde of nightmare creatures trying to eat them with a barrage of artillery fire at just the right moment. Huh? Maybe I should remember that method. Sunny remained on guard until the column of vehicles turned and left the coastal highway behind, climbing back into the mountains. It was only then that he allowed himself to relax and descended from the roof of the Rhino to its interior. After exchanging a few words with Professor Obel and Beth, he climbed into one of the sleeping niches and closed it to receive some privacy. There, he lingered for a few moments, and then summoned the runes. After thinking about it for a while, Sunny finally decided to take the risk and bind the mantle of the underworld to his soul. He did not know what would happen, and the idea of being left without a proper suit of armor was more than slightly disturbing, but, to tell the truth, Sunny was extremely curious to see what would happen. Soon he was staring at a string of shimmering runes. Bind the relic? He hesitated for a few moments, sighed, and then whispered quietly, yes. Sunny had dismissed the mantle, just in case, and was now wearing the soft fabric of the puppeteer's shroud. For that reason he did not see any changes immediately. For a few seconds nothing happened, and then the voice of the spell spoke. It said, "Your memory has been destroyed." Sunny's eyes widened. What? He flinched, almost hitting his head on the roof of the niche. His heart skipped a bit. What the hell? What do you mean? But then the voice of the spell resounded again. You have received an attribute. At the same time, Sunny felt a profound but unexplainable change. The change seemed to affect both his body and his soul. It was not painful, and did not feel harmful, just very, very strange. It was as if his skin turned to stone, but also remained exactly the same. At the same time, he felt as if the enchantments of the mantle of the underworld were at his fingertips, even though the onyx armor was not summoned, and in fact had been destroyed. Huh? Sunny remained motionless for a while, trying to understand what had happened to him. Then, unable to find answers, he turned his attention to the shimmering runes. In the list of his memories, there was no mantle of the underworld anymore. However, he now possessed a new attribute. Holding his breath, Sunny read, Attributes: Fated, Flame of Divinity, Master of Shadows, Blood Weave, Bone Weave. And there, a new string of runes appeared at the end. Attribute: Marble Shell. Chapter 975, Marble Shell. Marble Shell. Sunny stared at the runes with a thoughtful expression on his face, then concentrated on them. Immediately, new strings appeared in the air, forming a description. Attribute: Marble Shell. Attribute description: in the deep darkness of the underworld, a prideful demon forged 7 suits of splendid armor for his favorite creations. The intricate shells were both a boon and a test, since only those worthy of his regard could unlock the mantle's true potential and bear its weight. There were more runes, but Sunny stopped to think for a bit. Favorite creations. He knew that Saint and her kind were an artificial race created by Nether, the ruler of the underworld and the demon of choice or destiny, depending on how one decided to translate the runes. He also knew that Saint's armor bore a strong resemblance to the mantle of the underworld, although it was not quite as impressive. The original Stone Saint had been one of the smallest and weakest living statues that used to dwell in the Dark City. By the time Sunny reached the place of their battle against the fallen attackers, the bigger and more powerful warriors of her kind had already been destroyed, leaving only her, an awakened monster, to finish the fight. What he got from all that was that Saint had only been a foot soldier in Nether's army, most likely. The armor she wore was a true masterpiece of craftsmanship, but not something on the level of the 7 mantles, which had been gifted to the high-ranking officers of the Stone Legion by the Prince of the Underworld. Gods, if Saint is just a foot soldier, then just how terrifying was Nether's army? Well, they had to have been pretty terrifying, in order to challenge the gods. The Stone Saint he had killed on the desolate plaza of the Dark City was a pale remnant of her original self, as well, since the living statues had not been consumed by corruption yet during the war between the demons and the gods. Shaking his head, Sunny turned his attention back to the runes. The description of the marble shell was a bit unusual, since it included much more information than that of other attributes. He continued to read: attribute traits: living stone, feather of truth, stalwart, underworld armament, mantle, shell, bound. The first 4 were just like the enchantments of the old mantle, with the exception of stalwart. The extremely high protection against physical attacks and the high protection against elemental attacks remained the same, but the moderate protection against mind and soul attacks had been elevated to high protection as well. Very good. The defensive trait of the shell was passive, but the other 3 traits required essence to function. From now on, Sunny would have to circulate it through his own body in certain ways, instead of pouring it into the memory to activate the effect. That was a bit weird. Luckily, he seemed to possess an instinctive understanding of how the essence had to be circulated exactly, and his control over it was intricate enough to achieve the desired result. The other 3 traits, however, were extremely interesting. The mantle and shell were connected and in fact mutually exclusive. That was because those were not really traits, but actually forms that his new attribute could assume. The shell was a dormant form, while the mantle was an active form. As the shell, the armor existed under his skin, or rather was his skin. Basically, it provided all the benefits of the mantle of the underworld, including access to its enchantments, albeit in a muted and somewhat weakened form. Sunny dismissed the puppeteer's shroud and stared at his arm incredulously. His skin looked pretty much the same, but somehow even paler and smoother. Great. As if I wasn't being called a creepy porcelain doll often enough already. He sighed, then jabbed his arm with a finger. There was something strange. His skin remained soft and elastic, but when sufficient pressure was applied, it suddenly became hard as stone. Basically, it was becoming rigid when struck. After a few experiments, which must have looked really weird from the side, he determined that he could control the process consciously too. That's neat. So I will always have passive resistance to all kinds of damage. I'll be able to repair damage to my skin with the living stone as well, although that won't help me against internal injuries. He activated Feather of Truth and felt his fist becoming much, much heavier. Then, he made his entire body extremely light. Ah, this feels so weird. Sunny did not exactly start to float, but he could potentially jump extremely high or hit extremely hard with the help of this new ability. The applications were nearly endless. A silly smile appeared on his face. And I can always enhance the effect of a single charm as well. Better yet, by augmenting his body with the shadows, he would be augmenting his shell too, considering that it was a part of him. That, in fact, that was the real benefit of binding the armor. Sunny's eyes widened. Wait a second. Had he not dismissed the puppeteer's shroud to take a look at his skin? Which meant that he could benefit from the defensive qualities of the shell and summon an armor-type memory on top of that, using both to protect himself at the same time. Damn, that was simply incredible. Sunny was consumed by excitement for several minutes, then remembered that he currently had no powerful armor-type memories to speak of. Well, it did not matter too much. He would find one eventually. Plus, there was the mantle trait of the marble shell as well. Its function was pretty simple. It activated the attribute, making it assume the form of a full suit of armor. Unlike memories, Sunny did not have to spend essence to summon the mantle, since it was simply a transformation of the shell. Similarly, the mantle was considered to be a part of his body, and so augmenting one with the shadows would strengthen the other in turn. In its active form, the attribute awakened its full power. The effects of Stalwart, Living Stone, Underworld Armament, and the Feather of Truth were not weakened anymore, reaching their full potential. Sadly, wearing another armor-type memory on top of the mantle was out of the question. Still great. So, Sunny had not really lost his armor. On the contrary, it had become stronger and could be summoned in its full glory at any moment. It's just that the mantle was now an innate part of him, as opposed to a memory. And finally, there was the bound trait. Its function was very simple. It bound the marble shell to Sunny's soul, which meant that one would grow alongside the other. Currently, the attribute was of the ascended rank, just like Sunny. If Sunny became a saint, the marble shell would become transcendent too. Laying in the sleeping niche and feeling the rhino vibrate around him, Sunny closed his eyes and let out a satisfied sigh. 6,000 kills. Ah, it was worth it.